Welcome to Dabo Recap. Enjoy your viewing. Subscribe. The story begins with the main character opening his eyes, not understanding where he is. He is in a clean room, and above him stands a hesitant servant who is glad that his young master is awake. Our hero, a little perplexed as to who it was and what was happening around him, simply watched silently for a while. Having come to his senses, he stood up in a panic and began to wonder if he had moved into someone else's body. Looking at the servants, he thought, observing the furniture around and the clothes on the guy, he quickly came to the conclusion that this was most likely not a movie. Having examined him extensively, he accepted that he had moved into someone else's body, that the person opposite was a real servant, and his gaze went blank. Suddenly, his attention was attracted by something behind the young servant, and our hero began to examine everything. After looking closely at the room, he noticed writings made by a calligrapher during the reign of Zhentong in the Ming dynasty, as well as furniture designs that were not popular until the end of Zhentong's reign. Our hero decisively asked the young servant if he understood correctly that now was the time of Hongji's reign, and received a positive answer. He remembers history lessons and the huge army that staged a coup in the country. What was left from the last emperor was a complete mess. Corrupt officials, betrayals, an empty treasury, and people unable to even feed themselves. All this happened during the reign of the Hongji emperor, who gave the country time to breathe. As a result of all the events, historians called this period the Silver Age of Hongji. Having understood and accepted the whole situation, he began by remembering that although the current emperor was recognized as a saint, history left many questions unanswered. Smiling calmly, he said out loud that a lot of work could await them, but he did not mention what kind of work it would be. The surprised servant, covered in sweat, clarified what our hero was talking about, and what kind of business he had that appeared out of nowhere. The next second, he began to call for help, claiming that the young master was feeling ill again. Our hero, not understanding this action, froze a little. Just as he was about to lie down on the bed, he noticed 3 large shadows on the curtains and decided to ask who it was and what was happening looking back. It turned out to be 3 muscular men who clearly came to him for a reason. The main character is sure that this will not end well. Behind them, a man dressed as a doctor is approaching. He shouts that the young master is sick again and urgently requires acupuncture. With apologies, all 3 men attacked the poor young gentleman who did not understand what was happening around him. He tried to stop them, asked them to stop, but all his requests were in vain. A thin silver needle, which the doctor held in his hand, gleamed above him. Smiling calmly, he, trying to reassure our hero, said that his brain was affected by an illness, and he should not run away or worry. Everything would end as soon as the needle was stuck into the right point. Our hero shouted that he was not sick, asked them to stop. His gaze was full of fear from not understanding what was happening. But the doctor didn't care. He continued to say that his acupuncture technique had been passed down through generations. He was confident that he could cure the disease with a simple injection. Having finished his long statement, he rushed towards our hero. With a loud scream, the doctor stuck a needle into the main character's head, which passed through all the protective layers and its tip plunged into the brain. Losing consciousness and experiencing severe pain, the guy began to shout at the old man that these methods would not cure him, but would rather kill him. The loud cry of our hero was heard throughout the entire estate in which he was located. While a needle is stuck in our hero's head, the doctor declares that the ailments of the mind can be cured, and even he can only temporarily relieve the symptoms. After all, everything else will depend on the young master and his luck. The worried servant begs to save the young master, because he is the only son of his master. While they were having a dialogue, our hero, without moving, lay between them. He was completely unconscious, sweating, and bubbly foam was flowing from his mouth. A month later, our hero is still lying in bed. His head is wrapped in a bandage, his eyes still have not acquired a clear color. And the most important thing is his unbearable desire to kick the old man. But there are also advantages. After lying in bed for a whole month, he finally understood who he was, whose body he occupied, who his parents were, and his way of life. The real owner of the body was none other than the only son of Daminan and Fan Jinlong, the Fang family, which gained a noble title during the fierce battle of Jiangnan. After the battle, with a wave of his hand, the Yongle Emperor handed them an iron bowl of rice. And now we are finally revealed the name and identity of the main character. The past owner of Fang Jingfang's body is the worst among the youth in the capital, a bastard among bastards, known as a good-for-nothing brawler. Now, clutching his head, our hero finally realized why everyone thought he was sick when he suddenly began to speak like a normal person. He decides to start behaving like the previous owner, and so, in his opinion, others will no longer consider him mentally ill. From now on, he will behave like a real villain. This decision will be the most correct in his opinion. While our hero was pondering his next actions, a servant and a young maid came into his room and greeted her master. Starting to delve into the role, the first thing he decides to do is pester the servants with questions about what time it is and what they want from him. Jing Fan jumped up and started shouting at the servants. Why was there so much noise coming from somewhere so early in the morning? The young maid replied that it was already late morning. Tears began to form in her eyes, and her body broke out in a light sweat. He looked into her eyes and mentally asked for forgiveness, mentioning that now he has to be a bastard, he has no choice. Then, after thinking a little, he decided to take her by the shoulders, pulling her towards him. He said that he was glad to see her and asked to look at her closer. By the way, her name is Xiang Xiang. The young servant, standing aside, began to joyfully shout that the young master was wise. He was also a warrior, and in general he was beside himself with admiration. Jin Fan, in response to such words, ordered him to go to where the mountains are dangerous, and the waters are even more dangerous. At the same time, leaning his hand on the table, he hit the servant in the face with both legs. While the poor servant lay near the entrance, our hero rose against all the words he had spoken, saying that he was nothing more than worthless trash. The young boy lay on the floor with a swollen face and began to cry quietly, groaning. The main character looked at the boy with interest, noticing that he was crying, and wondered if he had pressed him too hard. He is, of course, sorry, but otherwise he won't be like himself. But unexpectedly, the young servant jumped up, running up to our hero, and began joyfully saying that he was crying with happiness that his master had finally recovered. Our hero did not quite understand what happened, but it seems that everything worked out, and now no one will consider him sick or mentally traumatized. When he heard the news about the protagonist's recovery, the doctor came running and immediately unwrapped his set of silver needles and wanted to carry out preventative work. An enraged Jin Fan began shouting at the old man, threatening to beat him up and also chasing him away. Joyfully, the doctor congratulated our hero on his recovery and ran away as quickly as possible so that his mood would not suddenly change. After seeing the old man off, the young servant said with a joyful smile that since such a famous doctor reported his recovery, there was no need to worry, and by the way, there would be no more acupuncture. It was the words about the abolition of acupuncture that moved the main character to tears. Having finished shedding tears of joy, he began to wonder a little dejectedly whether he would have to behave so badly forever. But suddenly his face filled with brutality. He felt like an omnipotent man who must change everything, because it is his duty. Turning to the boy servant, he said that he would accompany him during his walk. Having run to get clothes for his young master, he brought the best he had, and our hero began to dress. Jin Fan turned into a real handsome man, pinning up his hair and taking in his hand a beautiful, expensive fan that gave his style a special zest. As he was about to go out into the street, he was suddenly very surprised by something, a face of obvious surprise. It turns out that he simply did not expect that the estate in which he lives is so huge. Walking up the steps, he reasons and looks around. In his opinion, there are at least 50 acres there. Looking at the roofs, he likes the frequent corrugations on them, so much so that he cannot contain his surprise and a slight smile. Walking past the pond, he notices that the property has a main and state hall, a backyard, and a whole bunch of other rooms. But still, he is not satisfied with one small detail. In his opinion, the whole place is a bit old. Complete darkness and despondency, nothing more. Our hero turned to the servant and called him by name. It turns out his name is Dung Dung. He suggested that he was sick because his house was terribly old, so he thought the place needed a renovation. Adjusting his hat, which almost fell off due to the shock of such unexpected words, he informs Jin Fan that although his idea makes sense, it is too expensive for them. The main character does not believe that they have no money, citing their majestic possessions as an example, but the servant replies that he would not dare to lie. Dung Dung reports that his master does not pay attention to the surrounding area. Thousands of acres of their land are completely sown. Although because of this, he receives many awards and praises, they do not have much money, because all of it is a gift from the imperial treasury. Ozanation came to him, most likely due to the fact that there are too many unique banknotes from the emperor, and now they are losing value. Starting our reasoning, we can understand that in this era, the economy works on the following principle. The rich people rent out the land to the peasants. The harvest is exchanged for money, but since the costs of farming are too high, there is little money left. Having started pounding the wall, which made the servant a little surprised, our hero thought about what to do and how to earn money. But suddenly a spark ran through his body. He remembered that there were records of the local history of the Tongzhou region, and they contained quite valuable information. According to his recollections, in a few months, several ships on board which contained ebony were to sink north of Tongzhou. Why this particular memory? It's simple. Ebony was quite popular among the nobility during the reign of Hongji, and since the ships carrying it sank, prices began to rise steadily. As soon as the ships sink, wood will be in great short supply on the market, and the nobility will be ready to give any money for it. Our hero comes up with an incredible idea. To stock up on wood and then sell it, he hopes to earn quite a bit of money. On the way back to the room, our hero considers that although the idea with ebony wood is not bad, there is still a drawback. And this disadvantage lies precisely in the fact that it is still terribly expensive. Because of this, his face twisted into a displeased grimace. He decides to ask the servants how much money they have left. Dung Dung said reassuringly that they only had a couple hundred liang. Dissatisfied, Jin Fan approached the young servant, deciding to clarify how so. The thought appeared in his head that they wanted to force him to sell off his family's lands, as spendthrift sons like to do. Then the realization came to him that he was the big spender. It is our hero who is the king of losers, and if he decides to sell all the lands, then it will be very similar to him. Therefore, he ordered Dung Dung to call the manager and accountant. He was given 10 seconds to do everything. 10 seconds inside the estate flew by instantly. Both the manager and the accountant were already standing in front of the main character. Both were barely breathing and were also covered in sweat. They politely clasped their hands in front of them as they greeted their young master. Sitting in a less than respectful position, he asked the workers how much land he had. In response, he was informed that he owned a village outside the city, which reached 2,730 mu, as well as mountainous territories for another 1,000 mu. Smiling, he said that this was just wonderful and demanded to call the broker. According to him, he had big news. Taking on something resembling a cool pose, he pointed a fan at the workers and gave the order to sell all the land so that not a single mu remained. And the young servant and the manager and the accountant, all three had no words. They did not understand what had come over the young master. After the shock, all three fainted. The servants running around them tried to bring them to their senses, and for some it was even necessary to carry heart pills. Closing his eyes, our hero clearly said that if one of them continues to pretend and refuses to work, he will be castrated on the spot without a chance of pardon. After such clear words, all three ran away, leaving behind only a stream of wind. Screams could be heard from far away that the gentleman had finally recovered completely. Watching the servants run away as directed, he straightened his hair and became convinced that the more harshly he treated it, the faster it would work. After a short period of time, a broker named Wen Junyang was already standing in front of the main character. He greeted him politely, addressing him as a young prince. Interrupting him, he said that politeness only wastes time. Next came the question whether he knew about his lands and whether he wanted to inspect them. Junyan refused, because everyone already knows the lands of the great Feng family very well. He told our hero that if you take 1 acre for 32 liang, and he has at least 2,000 acres in his possessions, then the land price will easily cost about 70,000 liang. The broker's words did not make our hero happy because 70,000 is quite a little, and if he starts to bargain normally, they might start poking him with needles again. But his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by Junyan, who drew attention to something behind Jin Fan, saying that he did not expect such extraordinary things from his mansion. This surprised him a little. It turns out that the broker's attention was caught by a painting hanging behind him. This is the painting and calligraphy of Zhao Yuan's Seeing Off the Guest of the Qinchuan River, and it is truly treasured. The fact that it hangs in the main hall is truly amazing. Jin Fan, not knowing what it was, immediately paid attention to it. But when he heard that such a treasure as this painting was so valuable that it was almost impossible to buy it anywhere, a plan that was ingenious in his opinion immediately came to his mind. He instantly approached the broker, hugging him around the neck. He informed him that he was a fool and could safely buy it. He also mentioned that there is a lot of stuff in his house. Surprised, Junyan agreed to take a look at everything our young master had to offer. The young servant and 2 workers began to panic and ask what their young master was doing. Carefully covering his face with a fan, he looked at those 3 with a slight smile and said that everything was clearly visible. He was going to sell all the valuables for money. While our hero calmly escorted the broker further into the estate, in the background they were hastily trying to revive Dung Dung, the manager and accountant, who, according to the doctor who came running, had a heart attack. The next day began with loud cries in the estate that the master had returned. Our hero immediately broke out in a light sweat from surprise that his father had returned. He had never expected to meet him so soon, moreover, immediately after the sale of all the family property. The gentleman standing majestically in front of the entrance asked what happened to his son Ji Fan. A sharp gaze directed at the house where the young gentleman lived. His hair was secured with a golden hairpin with a beautiful stone set into it. But the next moment his whole serious image was destroyed by a sparkling smile. He asked if everything was okay with him, and how he was doing in general. Shouting for him to come out and hug his father, he headed to the main hall. Jin Fan was incredibly worried at this moment, and didn't know what to say since all the items were sold out. The joyful dad, having opened the door, with his arms outstretched to the sides, was about to meet his son, and also asked from the threshold whether he had any problems. But in front of him stood his son, surrounded, and although no, There was nothing that could surround him except a table and 2 benches behind him. Everything else is dust blown across the floor by the wind. After standing a little longer, trying to comprehend the situation, he was overtaken by bitter disappointment. He realized that there were no his expensive paintings, no expensive calligraphy, not understanding where everything had gone. He clutched his heart and began coughing up blood. The doctor and servants arrived to help again. He, trying to calm the gentleman, said that the young gentleman had simply sold them to gain money. According to him, this should be commonplace. Dad quickly got to his feet and said that all this could be forgotten because there was still so much land on their estate that it would be enough for several generations. But the servants nearby apparently immediately realized that the gentleman still didn't know anything. But the doctor quickly corrected the situation by informing him that the young master had sold all their lands to buy ebony wood. Judging by the old man's look, he clearly did not expect such a turn. Clutching his heart again and starting to cough up blood, he began to beg for forgiveness from his ancestors, not understanding for what deeds such karma overtook him. Watching everything that was happening, our hero wondered why his father, who should be a great general, had such weak self-control. His face was full of bewilderment. The doctor, putting his hand on the gentleman, told him not to worry about anything. He would quickly cure him, but the old man apparently already knew the methods of this doctor, so completely accepting his fate, he asked to let him die in peace. The doctor did not give up trying to persuade the gentleman to agree to accept his help, because he must hold on. Jin Fan, clenching his fist for his father, mentally asked him to hold on, be strong, and most importantly, wait for the prices of ebony to skyrocket. He also vowed to return everything to the last penny. Let's move to a slightly different place, the city standing under the clear glare of the sun's rays. We see an unknown young guy who repeats some lines and begins to repeat the word order non-stop. A man sitting next to him asked the boy what kind of order he had, and whether he should study at all. He angrily asked if that was all he could remember in half a month. It turns out he taught the doctrine of identifying traitors. They were both dressed in bright, obviously expensive clothes. Is it possible that this is a prince in the company of the emperor's father or the imperial teacher? Looking sternly at the guy, the man asked him a question. Did he really not pay enough attention when he was diligently taught by a certain Master Zhang? Scratching his head, the boy replied that he admitted his guilt by using a third-person address to himself in the sentence. You can also spend a little time on his appearance, an absent-minded but neat face, snow-white skin, robes with a bright dragon pattern, and a hat with the same golden dragons on it. The man angrily began to shout that the guy turned out to be a prince and the future heir to the throne. Having become even more agitated, sweat began to appear on his face. And again, speaking about himself in the third person, he began to say that he understood. The man's anger did not subside. He continued to shout at the poor prince and reproach him that if he does not study, there will be no awareness. And how will he rule the country without understanding the simple truths of the world? Without lowering his tone, he added that he must finally get down to business. The boy, unable to find words to justify himself, just continued to speak about himself in the third person. Looking at the young prince's face, he thought that he might have gone a little overboard with his moralizing. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes and calmed down. He decided to come closer to the poor prince, who could not say anything. Approaching him and putting his hand on his head, the man said that the boy's mother had spoiled him greatly, but despite this, he should not repeat such mistakes in the future. The prince calmly agreed and promised to remember everything. Directing his gaze towards the exit, he said that the lord of the Nianhe region had returned after successfully suppressing the uprising in the southwest, and it was time for them to go to Beijing. He asked the eunuch standing there why they had not moved out yet. Respectfully addressing the man as Your Majesty, he said that news had arrived about the lord of the Nianhe district, and it turned out that he had fallen. By the way, after the eunuch's conversion, we can safely assume that that man is the emperor. Surprised by such unexpected news, the emperor asked what happened. The eunuch quickly answered, "The fault is the son of the poor lord, the main scoundrel, trash and scum of the capital." The emperor was angry with our hero, called him a prodigal son, and also blamed the lord's overprotection of him for everything. Mentioning that the Jiao Yue passing exam for the nobility would begin soon, he ordered that Jin Fan also participate, and if he refused, he was ordered to tie him up and drag him there by force. The eunuch, having accepted His Majesty's order, folded his hands in front of him and bowed respectfully. The prince sitting behind could not contain his laughter, so he began to chuckle quietly, but unfortunately, the emperor heard everything. Furious with him, he began shouting that he had no right to laugh, because he had gotten away with it. With shouts, he drove the young prince to rewrite the distinction of traitors 20 times. The poor fellow, having heard such an order, was ready to burst into tears. But still, unable to bear it, he shouted that he was guilty, so loudly and sincerely that it could be heard for the next 100 meters. Then we will return to the estate of our hero, who has sold all his property, and from the threshold we will hear the protagonist's poor dad tearfully asking for forgiveness from his ancestors. They dine at an ordinary table, sitting on simple logs. The Lord asks his son to give him a new bowl of rice because snot got into his bowl. Our hero simply cannot find the words to answer him, but he decides to turn to him, calling him daddy and asking him to stop crying. His face looked quite sincere. The surprised father asked him what he called him. Why was he surprised? Yes, because his son never addressed him like that. Maybe he got sick again? He hurriedly peeked around the corner and began shouting for someone to call a doctor, because apparently it was his son. But he didn't have time to finish speaking after our hero drew his attention to this. Jumping up behind him, he covered his mouth with all his might and began telling him to shut up, calling him an old fool, and also told him not to call that bastard with the needles, because there was nothing wrong with him, but he recommended that his father have his hearing checked. The gasping lord was able to say through his closed mouth that he finally recognized his healthy son. After finishing his meal, while Jin Fan was resting with his back against the wall, the Lord began to say that he would never be able to grow up like that. Despite all the blessings of his ancestor, he is too lazy. Since childhood he did not like to do anything, neither read nor study, and even practice martial arts. Although the Lord, as a father, does not care about the opinions of others about his son, but still, sometimes when he sees the children of officials participating in Jiawei, he is overcome with envy. Slowly approaching the main topic, he mentioned that Jiawei is about to begin, and as a father, he is worried about the future of his child, so he slowly hints that he would like to see his son take part there, in case he succeeds. Smiling, he says that he would like to see how his son will live happily until the end of his days. But our hero does not seem entirely satisfied with such a proposal. He knows that the so-called Jiawei is an examination for the nobility, and only after it, their status will become official. Otherwise, such a title will bring nothing but pennies. It was clear from his gaze how much he did not want to go there. The Lord, with a calm smile, began to stroke his son on the head while he cursed him in his thoughts. Clenching his fists, our hero became very tense, which was visible on his face. In his head, he screamed that even if he tied him up, he would never go there. The old man should be on the side of his son and nothing else. But then suddenly a young servant ran into the courtyard, and all in a panic announced that visitors had arrived from the imperial palace. Continuing his report, he said that the emperor, having learned about the problem of raising their young master, ordered him to be tied up and taken to Jiawei. The main character, clearly not expecting such a setup, cursed everyone, which cannot be said about his father, who, from such joyful news for himself, almost crushed his son's firebrand. Well, let's move to the square, where all the noble young people who are going to take part in the Jiawei have gathered. On a hill, a man in a scientist hat gave a speech in which he said that all those who arrived were representatives of wealthy families. All of them were gifted with the grace of their ancestors. As he continued speaking, he mentioned that the current exam would be divided into different stages and ranks. The purpose of this is to find exceptional talents with outstanding skills, those who are ready to serve their country faithfully. At the end of his speech, he said that everyone would have to fight for the honor of their ancestors and could receive their golden belt. Everyone standing in the crowd loudly and unanimously agreed with the words of the man making the speech and shouted that they would do everything to get the belt. But someone among the crowd shouted that he was in pain and asked him to loosen his bonds. Surprised by this behavior, the respondent asked who burst out and demanded to be brought to him. But in the next moment, his face was filled with indescribable emotions. Absolutely nothing was clear from his expression. But the same cannot be said about the crowd of participants. Everything was clearly visible from them. Everyone covered their mouths as one so as not to laugh. A man walked through the crowd, and I think everyone already knows who it is. You just have to look at the color of the clothes to guess who it is. The crowd burst into unimaginable laughter. Everyone was laughing and pointing fingers without being able to stop. The whole square was buzzing with laughter. Our hero walked through the center of the square with a completely serious expression on his face. But in his thoughts he cursed everyone he knew, because the method by which he was tied was clearly not intended for such use. Still, they agreed to untie him, and as soon as the rope fell from him, he sighed with relief. While he was kneading his stiff bones, he looked up in surprise. Let's find out what happened. In front of him stood a huge manager, who immediately called our hero a piece of shit and threatened that if it weren't for his father, he would have torn him right where he stood. Leaning close to him, he clarified that the protagonist's father could do nothing but look at him from the side, so he was not allowed to disgrace himself in front of everyone. In response to all the words of the huge man, Jin Fan only thought that he was not comfortable being stared at. The exam has begun, and we immediately see the tense face of our hero, who is dissatisfied with something. Also not expressing dissatisfaction or other emotions, the completely serious face of the very person watching the exam. Now it is clear that with their faces, the observer sat opposite our hero. He does not take his eyes off him while everyone turns in their direction. The drooping Jing Fan, cursing the old man, is completely sure that he has killed a lot of people. In his presence, one must control words and behavior, and it is most likely not possible to deceive him. The man standing in front of everyone holds a sign in his hands with a question written on it. He slowly raises it, announcing the first question. Raising the sign above our heads, we can consider the question. It sounds like the calm of Southwest China. Our hero's eyes instantly filled with unimaginable surprise, and he repeated the question to himself. He immediately began to remember the history course from his past life. He remembered that since the beginning of the Ming dynasty, the emperor had classified the lands of the southwestern provinces as his territories. However, one but arose. Local tribes, their leaders, and regular uprisings made the southwest an extremely dangerous region. These events sowed confusion in the imperial court. Raising his brush over the paper, he thought that such an event was the source of the Hongzhi emperor's unrest. He decided to take advantage of this opportunity. Having thought through everything he was going to write, he became determined to clear his name. With a serious expression on his face, he shouted so that everyone would notice that he began to write, his hand quickly moving from side to side. The observer was full of bewilderment. He could not even imagine that this little brat could write. Everyone present in the room, as well as those watching, could not believe their eyes when they saw that such a scoundrel like our hero could write. For them, it was simply impossible. Jin Fan, not paying attention to all the noise surrounding him and the surprised voices of the participants, continued to write so that his name would be completely cleared. The observer continued to be surprised, because then he noticed how neat the main character's handwriting was. Smiling contentedly, our hero said that this was just the beginning. He told everyone to watch carefully. Concentrating, his eyes began to shine furiously. He was incredibly tense. He sped up and began to write many times faster. His hand moved back and forth, from side to side. But at the same time, the brush lay smoothly on the paper without making a single extra stroke. The observer opened his mouth in surprise. He simply could not believe his eyes. He was surprised, calling our hero a psycho, and mentioned that if he can write so quickly, he really can represent something valuable. Having finished writing, Jin Fan carefully rolled the piece of paper into a bundle and, beaming, handed it to the beholder. Complete confidence was visible in his eyes. At this moment, the observer broke down a little, not understanding anything, and why he did not understand anything, and was surprised, we learned from the words of other participants. Everyone in the room looked at our hero in surprise, and said that only 2 sticks of incense had burned out, and there was still a lot of time left. One of the participants laughed loudly and said that since he was a loser and remained so, he was sure that our hero could not be able to write something in such a time. But fully confident in the correctness of his answer, Jin Fan quickly ran away from the exam site, and even the cry of the observer who insulted him could not stop our satisfied boy. Immediately after all the past events, our hero came home where he was met by a frightened servant, who asked from the doorway whether his young master should have gone to Jiawei, and in general why he returned home so early. He just called the young servant an idiot who doesn't know about taking the exam early. Pretending that he understood everything, Ding Ding asked whether his master had passed the exam or not. Straightening his beautiful hair, his gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, and without coming up with any answer, he said that everything seemed to go well, but in reality, it was so-so. After the exam, the emperor was given outstanding works, one of which he is holding in his hands right now, joyfully squeezing and praising. Having said that this is simply a wonderful work, beautifully written by someone else's pen. With an incredible smile on his face, he began to wonder who wrote such a brilliant answer. But as soon as his attention was drawn to the small signature at the very bottom of the page, which incredibly surprised His Majesty the Emperor, the name of our beloved Jin Fan was written there. Seeing the name of this petty asshole, as the Emperor called him, he bulged his eyes in surprise as he peered at the work. Tensely, the Emperor decides to read for us everything that is written in the answer, and begins with the so-called adaptation. Local chiefs initially ruled the southwestern regions, which were populated by ethnic minorities. However, after a while they became local lords of the territories, which began to threaten the integrity of the central government. If they are recognized as part of the government, the imperial system of government will undergo significant positive changes. The Emperor couldn't believe that the good-for-nothing Jing Fan could come up with such a great plan. After thinking it over carefully, he decided that he urgently needed to meet our unexpectedly genius hero. The eunuch who is always near His Majesty reported on the appearance of news which says that Feng Jingfan has opened his stall in the Eastern Market. Unable to resign himself to the desire to find out who our hero really is, the emperor decides to go out into the city as a commoner. The prince jumped out from behind and said that he was going to go with his father, the emperor, to which he replied that the boy just doesn't have to study, and then everything will be fine with him. The street is filled with a bunch of people. This is the very Eastern Market to which the emperor went undercover. Jin Fing sat in the couch and listened to the young servant plaintively say that he could not get ebony right now. Having irritably shouted at the boy, asking what he meant, he apologized for his mistake and promised to immediately bring wood for the young master. Leaning on his arm, the main character thought that it had become much easier for him to maintain his image of a hooligan. But his attention was distracted by the sudden appearance of someone who would hardly have come with good intentions. Standing in front of him were two men who arrogantly asked if he was Feng Jingfan. Looking at them with a suspicious look, a thought occurred to him. Are these two perhaps his father's next enemies? And then his attention was attracted by a eunuch he knew, who stood respectfully behind the man. He recognized him. It was the same eunuch who tied up our hero to take him to Jiawei. Looking at them carefully, Jin Fan began to reason why that eunuch was so respectful next to this guy. He concluded that the nasty eunuch could follow the bearded man, only in one case more likely. Immediately, our hero bowed his head, and, holding his folded hands in front of him, respectfully greeted His Majesty the Emperor. The Emperor and his entourage were a little surprised by such a quick revelation, which cannot be said about Ding. He almost had a seizure from such a statement. At first, the Emperor did not know how to behave and what to say. As small beads of sweat ran down his face, he figured out where to start the conversation. He quoted lines from the main character's answer, written during the so-called exam, and asked if that was his answer. Continuing to be in a state of respectful bow, the main character confirmed the words of the Emperor, saying that yes, this is exactly the conclusion he came to in his answer. Continuing the conversation, the Emperor says that as soon as they separate the southwestern Tusi leaders from themselves, uprisings will not be long in coming, although our hero's idea was quite good in words. But in reality, it has several major shortcomings. Smiling, Jingfan shows that everything is fine, and says that no matter what, in fact, this topic can offer 3 strategies for solving problems. The first strategy would be to deal with the forces of the leaders and local authorities simply by pitting them against each other, in which case, serious losses await all of them. The second strategy is to use brute force to get the better of them and force them to surrender to the authorities. Well, the third strategy was a way to deal with the local authorities by giving them their land, providing them with resources and building schools, giving them the opportunity to study for positions, but in such a way that they would support the imperial court. If you use this method, then even if the local leaders revolt, they will not receive support, and there will be no point in the rebellion. The surprised emperor considered such a detailed solution simply brilliant. Now in his eyes, our hero is far from being as simple as he seems. But the emperor's thoughts were interrupted by someone's cry, saying that the ebony had been delivered. Under the wall, there was a large tree trunk for delivery, and the poster behind it showed a fixed price of 100 liang. Seeing such an incredibly inflated price, the emperor opened his mouth and began to loudly express his opinion. Approaching Jingfan closely, he began to shout that he, using the privileges of the Nanhei estate, decided to force commoners to buy and sell goods for his own sake. By the way, this is a crime. Our hero in response made an innocent face and said that simply setting a price does not force anyone to bid. Everything is entirely voluntary. The emperor, without calming down, continued to shout at him, saying that he was taking him for a fool, because if this was an honest purchase and sale, then no one in his right mind would come to him and pay so much. Immediately after his words, a man ran through the crowd shouting that he could buy Jingfan's ebony for 50 liang. While the emperor could not find words from surprise, the buyer was already asking how much wood our hero had in stock. Already sweating as he ran, he shouts that he needs everything. He is ready to buy Jinfan's entire supply. Returning home, the emperor stood in the gazebo, reasoning that Jifan was a real find. He stood and praised his intelligence, and wit, not forgetting to mention that although he was a genius among scoundrels, he was still very talented. But looking back at his son, he could not say anything about him that was said about our hero, because at that moment the prince was sitting and laughing while playing with a toy. While he was jumping around the emperor with the toy, he said how much he was worried about his future, and even hired the most famous teachers. But he shouted sharply, not understanding how he had the audacity to suffer from useless garbage, and he screamed so loudly that the wooden toy broke. Upset by the behavior of his child, the emperor ordered him to rewrite the topic about the reformation of local lands and the return of former greatness 100 more times. Also, while the prince began to shed tears, he added that if he tried to cut back, he would immediately lose the imperial condescension. The angry prince clenched his fists and repeated the title of the topic to himself. He was clearly very angry. And since we already know that our poor prince does not shine with intelligence, we are not surprised that he further considered Jin Fan to be guilty of his punishment and promised to take revenge on him. In the square among the crowd, our hero stands. Behind him stands a young servant familiar to us, who asks his master to calm down. But he, without listening to him, continues to prevent Broker Feng from bargaining, saying that despite all his worries, he will not let him down. His final decision is 100 liang but not 50. The fat man, starting to tense up, makes a bet of 80 liang, saying that he cannot afford more. But our hero's categorical answer is a refusal, because its price is 100 liang and not a penny less. Having lost, the fat man, unable to bear the load, spat out blood, but still agreed with the price set by the main character. Laughing loudly, he couldn't be happier that he was able to not only buy back all the property he sold, but also earn quite a lot of money. He's simply incredible. Ding Ding jumped out from behind and began pointing ahead, saying that there was a crowd there, hinting that they simply had to go and see what was happening there. Conversations were heard among the huge crowd, but what stood out most was the address to the three young gentlemen, who said that since they were scholarship holders, their shop did not cost them anything. They answered that their business was too small and they could not leave a person to die, so they said it was no good. The man, pointing somewhere with his hand, said that the guys should find another place to live, and he would even forget about their debts if they left right now. Three guys, respectfully addressing the man as boss, asked for a couple more days. They promised to pay him later. Standing among the crowd, Jing Fan decided to ask what was going on, trying to look further, passing through the dense crowd. He decides to listen to what they are saying in the crowd. One asked what was going on there, and received the answer that at first there were 4 of those guys until one of them got sick, and the other 3 had to spend all the money on his treatment. Looking at them, he says that he sincerely feels sorry for the guys, because there is a month left before the provincial exam. Looking with interest towards the guys who bowed their heads, he saw in them real intellectuals. The servant standing next to him, without an ounce of sense of proportion, began to laugh loudly throughout the entire street, saying that such a situation could only make one laugh. Jing Fan at this time was thinking how he, being a scoundrel, could help them, so that the monster posing as a doctor would not start poking him with needles again. He decides that everything will go well if he manages to enter into a conversation correctly. There was loud laughter among the whispering crowd. Our hero, pointing his fan at the guys, called them pretenders pretending to be friends. He urges them to get out quickly. The crowd began to shout indignantly that his statements were too rude, disgusting, and that in general the speakers should be taught a lesson for this. After hearing so many threats from the angry crowd, Jing Fan was going to quiet down without provoking the crowd. But a servant treacherously crawled out in front of him, shouting so that everyone would look in his direction, because these were the words of his young master. Our hero's eyes began to dim from such a betrayal. He could not have expected such a setup. People from the crowd began to threaten him, saying that it was impossible to be rude to everyone there. The hero, puzzled by the current situation, realizes that he may be in trouble and begins to think about how to get out of the situation. And then the young servant comes into play again, opening his mouth and shouting loudly that everyone there is too arrogant. While Jing Fan, who did not have time to answer anything, stood and looked at Ding Ding a little in surprise. He began to shout that people like them do not have the right to speak in front of his master, because he is a man of the Nyanhe estate. People hearing that our Nyanhe characters were not at all surprised by such arrogant behavior. Trying to follow the servant's words, he decided to continue his idea by saying that the 3 were pretending to be best friends, and he was sure that he was completely right. Standing in front of our hero, the guy speaking in front turned to him, saying that he had no intention of putting pressure on the gentleman and asked him to be polite. In response, Jing Fan called him just a fool, which the guy was clearly very surprised by. The poor guy, dumbfounded, did not know how to respond to such a harsh and groundless insult, and was just about to say something. When the next insult fell upon him, he called him worthless trash, to which the boy again did not have time to respond. Why? Yes, because the next insult, sounding like an ordinary beggar pretender, finished off the poor fellow. So much so that he, clutching his heart, began to spit blood. The remaining friends, picking up the wounded guy, said that our hero had greatly insulted them. Jing Fan completely agreed with their words, adding with a sarcastic smile on his face that he also wanted them to bow down before him and call him a master. One of the guys objected that this was crazy and why would they do this? In response to such a statement, our hero's hand reached inside the voluminous sleeve. With a deft movement of his hand, he took out 2 silver lands, and holding them out in front of the guys, he asked what they were thinking now. At that moment, by the way, they had no words. They just silently looked at such a decent amount. The guy looked at Ji Fen and said that he underestimated them. Squeezing the money in his hand, the main character calmly said that since they didn't want it, he would keep it for himself. Immediately after such a sharp phrase, One of the guys fell to his knees with a characteristic sound, but the next moment, all 3 scholarship recipients said their names with tears in their eyes. From left to right, Jiang Chen, Ouyang Zihe, and Liu Wenshan. In front of everyone, they bowed to the floor in front of Jing Fan, calling him master. Mentally, our hero even praised the guys for such a quick response. As soon as the guys got up from their knees, Jing Fan threw them 2 silver liangs, which were caught by the fellow who spoke more than the rest. Having looked at them, he asked them to take the money and not to make him despondent. The guys, with tears in their eyes and words that they were finally saved, accepted the money. Jin Fan turned away and was about to leave. But before that, he reminded the guys that the provincial exam would start very soon, and it wouldn't hurt them to find teachers within 3 days and learn at least something. These words made all 3 fellows spit blood at once. Having wiped his mouth with the fatal one, the guy asked the name of his savior and asked him to announce it so that all the guys would remember. Looking at him, he said to remember him because his name is Feng Jifan. Shouts of surprise erupted from the crowd, not expecting that it was Jin Fan. All the people screaming "Save yourself or run" rushed to scatter in different directions. A moment later, on the recently filled street, there were only 5 people left. From the rest of the people, there was only dust driven away by gusts of wind. With his cheeks puffed out, our hero sincerely could not understand why everyone ran away so quickly. On the way home, the young servant praised his master, saying that he looked absolutely magnificent when he taught those school children a lesson. Crossing the threshold of the estate, Jifan says that all Ding's words are nonsense, because he would not be himself if he had not done what he did. The servants, as always, simply agreed with their young gentleman and continued to silently accompany him. Immediately as he entered, another servant ran up to him, informing him that the master was calling him, and also that a guest had come to their estate. He just wanted to pass by the servants, making excuses, saying that he didn't care and didn't have time. But the servant shouted out that the guest had arrived from the imperial palace. Our hero's face was filled not with simple surprise, but with horror from surprise. He prayed that it was not the same examiner. Approaching the pavilion, he remembers that from rumors even the emperor himself is afraid of that mad old man. As soon as he crossed the threshold, he was immediately bombarded with a whole bunch of comments about being late. The remark was immediately followed by an insult, and yes, sitting next to our hero's father was that same examiner who did not close his mouth. He continued to shout that Ji-Fan had no right to make his father suffer. He mentions the exam and how he knew when it would start, so why didn't he prepare? How dare he finish so early? He said that he would now teach the slacker a lesson, and our hero, already about to defend himself, raised his hand in front of him. With a cry of preparation, he jumped up and headed towards the main character. Ji-Fan put his palm out in front of him and the old man had to stop abruptly, causing his back to pinch. He leaned close to his face and asked what he wanted to say before being nailed. He looked behind the examiner and smiled sweetly, asking his father if he was happy that he had such a son. The father, with a tear in his eye, replied that of course he was happy. Ji-Fan addressed the old man in formal language, telling him to pay attention to how happy his father was to see him and not experience any suffering. The examiner jumped up to our hero's father, called out and asked why he was pampering Ji-Fan so much. He simply remained silent. But the old man did not calm down, and continued to say that if our hero does not make any progress, then he will have no future. He said that it was simply impossible. He wouldn't be able to get married, and old man Fan would not have a daughter-in-law, and therefore grandchildren and granddaughters, and the Fan family would only face an inevitable end. The father, bowing his head, quietly said that he simply could not do this. The examiner continued to shout that everything he did was done only for him, to purely help him. Ji-Fan stood aside and thought what punishment the old man would prepare for him apart from beating. Our hero's father, closing his eyes, told Lao Tsang, that's the examiner's name, to leave him alone and generally do whatever he wanted. The old man again makes an unimaginable leap towards our as yet unrecognized genius. But he in turn, again with one movement and a cry to stand, immediately caused the old man's back to be pinched. He again leaned close to him and asked the same question. What again did he want to say as his last words? Addressing the old man as an uncle, he said that even during a war, one must know whether there is a reason to send troops or not. He asked to tell him what he had done wrong. The old man shouted angrily that Ji-Fan's mistake was that he made his father worry. Immediately after these words, a glow appeared between his hands. What is it? Our hero realized that old man Lao's only goal was to smack him, so resigned to his fate, he closed his eyes. Just as the examiner was about to deliver his crushing blow, a surprise occurred. Their cultural dialogue was interrupted by people looking for Feng Jifan. They came to him with an imperial decree. The father, concerned that his son had angered the emperor, jumped up from his seat and hurried out of the guest hall. Both Ji-Fang and the father with the examiner were all on their knees listening to the order, which said that our hero was participating in the exam and put forward an ingenious strategy to reform the local lands and return to their former greatness. won the heart of the emperor. He will also be awarded first place in the Gilia and will be awarded the gold belt immediately. Ji Fan, with a smile on his face, listened to the order absolutely calmly. Both old men opened their mouths at such unexpected news and grabbed each other. They did not know how to perceive such an order. My father began to cry. He didn't know how to describe his feeling at that moment. He was delighted and at the same time so moved. Everything felt like a dream and reality at the same time. It was a warm light, the radiance of which enveloped the old man from head to toe, filling him with life. At this time, Ji Fan had already put on a sparkling golden belt. His father described him as a shining sun, a rising star that illuminates the whole world, a star of hope. All this is about our hero. The examiner, opening his mouth in surprise, shouted that this was simply impossible. He just couldn't believe it. As soon as he calmed down, father and son began to be sarcastic. One said that some people called their son names, said that he was good for nothing, that he could not achieve anything. His father supported him, saying that someone else had said that he would not be able to find a bride for him and that the Fan family line would end. Old man Feng approached Lao and hugged him by the shoulder, offering him as an old friend to help him find a bride for his son. The old examiner, with panic on his face, suddenly remembered that he had unfinished business. Having quickly said goodbye, he jumped over a high fence and left in an unknown direction. Our hero's father, watching his old friends running back, noticed that his skills were still as good as ever. Then he thought that his son was still very promising and he couldn't rush into a wedding. We need to think it over carefully and find him a good wife. The thought occurred to him that His Highness the Emperor had a daughter, and not a very young one. Using an unintelligible emotion on his face, he raised his finger and looked at his son, saying that he had a great idea. Ji Fan didn't understand what his father was talking about, so he simply asked what he was talking about, and looked at him thoughtfully. Let's move to the Emperor's palace, the roof of which is decorated with beautiful golden tiles, as well as a variety of patterns. The servants inside were discussing that His Highness the Prince had been studying for several hours straight, and it was incredible. The second servant added that he was interested in finding out how he would do it. Full of kindness, the Emperor sitting opposite the Prince says that he needs to be obedient, study hard, and also that today he is not allowed to play. The Prince calmly agrees with the words of the Emperor's father, probably everything, because someone received moral teachings quite recently. While he was busy studying, the idea came into his head that as soon as he finished copying the scriptures, he should visit his grasshopper whom he missed. He also hopes that he is having fun alone. And yes, he is completely serious. He misses his grasshopper. This is not a joke. A moment later, the Emperor held another unscheduled preventive conversation with the Prince to help him distract himself from unnecessary thoughts. Looking at him with a sad look, he felt some kind of resentment, and quietly asked when the guy would come to his senses. The next day, Ji Fan was woken up by Xiang early in the morning. When he asked why, she informed him that the gentleman was expecting the young master at breakfast in the hall. Arriving tomorrow, my father immediately said that he wanted to ask a question, a very important question. He began by asking how he, from whom you usually don't expect either knowledge or skills, was able to pass. Before he could finish speaking, Ji Fan interrupted him, saying that he should not panic, because he did not cheat. He was just lucky to guess right. Then, looking into the face of his old man, he saw huge bags under his eyes and asked if he really didn't sleep all night because of this question. But the father answered in the negative, adding that he completely believed his son. He smiled and said that he was really proud and happy to be the father of such a guy. But there was still a problem with their property. Heading towards the exit, he adds that as soon as he saw their empty house, his heart sank. Ji Fan, finishing his breakfast, told the old man to just wait, because everything would be resolved soon. He wanted to say something else to his father, but he was interrupted by the servant. The man came with a report that Wang Junyun had arrived to our hero from the Eastern Market and wanted to meet with him. There are also about a dozen carts with him. The father was a little surprised and decided to follow his son to find out why the merchant had arrived. Wang Junyun stood in front of the entrance, politely greeting his father. He said that he had prepared all the money for the young master. Behind them stood carts with piles of money inside. Ji Fan came up from behind and said that there was no point in the old man worrying about inheritance and family property anymore, because here it was all in front of him. From surprise and sincere lack of understanding of what was happening, his jaw dropped almost to the floor. The merchant informed our hero that all the promised money had been delivered, but he did not have enough currency, so he would pay the rest in property. The news that everything taken from the Feng estate was returned to its place made my father drool. 300,000 silver liang were also delivered, and also 7,000 liang in gold. In addition, the lands from the outskirts of the capital began to belong to them again. He also brought valuable banknotes and capital stores worth a total of 1,300,000 liang. Hearing such a huge amount, all sorts of thoughts came to old Feng's head, which was already full of questions. He grabbed his son by the shoulders with complete seriousness and decided to clarify whether he was doing anything criminal. Sweating from such a serious reaction, Ji-fan told his father that this was all the money from the sales of ebony, because for some reason unknown to him, everyone seemed to have gone crazy and started buying it. Let's find out what the amount of 1 million liang is. All the wealth accumulated in the Nanhe estate was ruined by Feng Ji-fan, the prodigal son. In addition, they were all sold for a measly 123,000 liang in silver, but in the end everything paid off tenfold. The news of the Feng family's enrichment spread like wildfire among the residents, and there were rumors that their gold and silver were transported in many carts and carts. The news went so far that there was even talk of their special feng shui. After all the rumors, some time passed, and finally spring came. The cycle of life on Earth began again. The birds began to chirp louder, and the leaves on the trees turned green. In front of us stood a bowing fellow whom our hero once helped. He welcomed him as a patron, but his attention was attracted by a strange glow that shone in his eyes. Sitting in front of them was Ji-fan, emitting the glow of his wealth. All three of them were blinded. He was smiling and wearing new clothes made of exquisite material, some of the most expensive in the local market. He approached one of the guys we already knew, and putting his hand on his shoulder, said that his name didn't suit him, that the poor guy didn't understand a little. He believes that instead of Ouyang Ji, Ouyang Feng would be more suitable for him. It sounds more menacing as it seemed to him. But then a friend appeared who said that his name was Ouyang Feng. Ji Feng quickly apologized, asking him not to quickly take his words to heart. He was interrupted by one of the guys who began to say that in order to thank him as a patron, they came with offerings. Among their gifts of gratitude was dried meat, which looked quite tasty. Celery was also presented as a sign of intelligence and diligence. We haven't forgotten about dried longan, thanks to which enlightened and talented people are born. He wanted to say something else, but Ji-fan interrupted him, saying that he didn't need trash from poor students, and in general, they made his head spin. Apparently, the guy got a kick out of it. Looking back at them, our hero decides that these 3 scholarship recipients will definitely be useful to him in the future, and it is he who will benefit from this. He approaches them and says that he heard about the beginning of the provincial exam, and it will take place in just half a month. They confirmed his words. Perseverance and work will grind everything down, said Ji-fan, but added that without the help of an expert, this will not be very important. We need a person who will find a common language with the students and lead them to success. The guys started whispering, and their first guess was that the so-called patron had hired a famous teacher for them, and they thought that this way they might have a chance. As always, the most important fellow comes forward and asks to tell them where the hidden expert is. Making a glamorous face, Ji-fan points at himself and says that he is right in front of them. Hearing such encouraging words, all 3 immediately tried to quickly commit suicide. Having started training the poor guys, our hero picked up a stick that would be useful to him. Having seated 3 fellows in front of him, he, waving a stick, said that they should listen to their teacher and just let him try to do something this way or that. The main one among the 3 students sat and read lines from some book, preparing for the exam, and the lines said that we can only blame ourselves for our actions. Ji-fan, paying attention to this, asked what the guys were muttering about there and called them, along with the book, to come to him. Having read what was written on the cover, he loudly shouted the title of the book. This book was called the Book of Rituals. With a slight wave of the stick he was holding in his hands, the book was divided into 2 halves. The poor boy could not find words for such an act on the part of the supposed teacher. With a smile, our hero points a finger at Ouyang Feng, saying that he should no longer dare to appear in front of him with children's books. The guy was shocked by such a statement, so he clarified that that children's book contained the materials necessary for the exam. Ji-fan immediately hit student Feng with a stick, so hard that his head turned away, and a dent began to be visible on his cheek. Then he switched to the remaining 2 guys. They already understood what would happen next, but did not have time to react. Shouting not to be afraid, the hero hit them with such force that the guys scattered in different directions of the room. Turning away from the wall and clasping his hands behind his back, he proudly and calmly said that the teacher's words would be beneficial, and the most important thing was to try better. Ouyang Feng objected that he wasn't teaching them anything anyway, and what was the point of listening to him anyway? But Ji-fan, saying that he already knew all this, repeated his powerful blow, which had recently been demonstrated. Holding his face, Ouyang Feng, streaming with tears, bitterly shouted that this was all a mockery and in general he really missed his mom and dad. Making a serious expression on his face, our hero told the boys what topics Shuntian Prefecture had prepared for the exam. It was, don't be tempted by wealth and status. The effect of the imperial policy of care. Such a set, according to Ji-fan, will be understandable to any modern person by its name. But it doesn't matter, he suggested starting. After such serious words, All his seriousness evaporated, and he jumped up to the guys at the table and announced that he would now start asking them questions. Having unfolded a list of questions to the fellows, he said that they should not be offended if the teachers make them angry, since they cannot even answer these questions. With one last glimmer of hope, Ouyang Feng decides to ask if it is possible that our hero has read the Confucian canon and can write 8-pair essays. Ji Fan turned away in response to the question, and nervously putting his finger to his lips clearly answered that no, he had not read anything and could not do anything like that. The poor guys with tears in their eyes prayed to God for help and wondered why such a punishment had come to them in life. While the guys were screaming from Ji Fan's incessant beatings, a drooping man stood behind the closed door and quietly listened to the cries begging for help. Drops of sweat flowed down his temples, and taking a deep breath, he said that he felt sorry for those guys. Our hero's lessons continued until the night, and ended approximately when a bright moon rose in the sky. Under the light of the same month, Ji Fan's father, with a smile on his face, asked Manager Yan if his son was at home. He politely folded his hands in front of him and began to report that since our hero imposed his mentorship on those three, he has been collecting them on the estate, and then it will be difficult to describe everything that happens to the poor fellows. The lord of the estate, with his eyes closed, began to argue what geniuses those guys are. They are 3 talented students recognized by the state. They can even now be appointed politicians. But what is his son doing? Our hero beats and scolds them in turn, creating complete nonsense. Manager Yan bowed and expressed his opinion. He believes that the Lord should do something while the future of those students is not yet destroyed. But the categorical refusal of our hero's father knocked the manager off his feet in the literal sense of the word. Without understanding, he asked why not, to which he received the answer, "The Lord doesn't care what happens to those students, because it is for the good of the country." But the manager still asked to enlighten him, so that he could understand what exactly the country's defense was. The Lord, holding his hands out in front of him, began to shout that for now Ji Fan was simply mocking them. But only God knows what could happen when he leaves the house, and how many people will have to suffer because of his behavior and desires. Having gone on his way, he calmly said that for the sake of the integrity, peace, and safety of the world, everything must be left as it is, and he will personally compensate the children for the damage caused by our hero. And while the manager watched his retreating back, the Lord quietly added that God bless those guys, and also that he hoped for success in passing the provincial exam. This is how the remaining time before the exam flew by. Early in the morning, with the rooster crowing, it was time to leave. The morning was cloudy. The sky was overcast with gray clouds. The sun had not even appeared in the sky yet. On the threshold stood the manager, who apologized for everything that had happened and also wished the scholarship holders to receive a gold medal. The guys had already boarded the carriage. The last one remaining was Ouyang Feng, who politely thanked Yan and said with a smile that they would certainly see each other again. But then, his face filled with sadness, he believed that they would not get a gold medal. After such training, I think everyone would lose hope. As soon as all 3 were in the cart, they asked the guys who were going to carry them to hurry up if this would not be difficult for them. One of the men firmly grasped the holder and said that words were unnecessary, and they understood everything, however. Shouting to hold on tight, they rushed off with inhuman speed. The students inside the cabin began to fly up in different directions. Some were screaming, some were crying, and some were generally ready to release everything inside their stomach. Quite quickly, they reached the place where the provincial exam was being held. There was a person at the entrance. He checked everyone in line. The inspector checked everyone, asked their names and affiliation with one or another prefecture, and only then let them inside. The first of our students to arrive was Ouyang Ji from Boadin Prefecture. Holding onto the wall with one hand and covering his mouth with the other so that nothing unnecessary would get in after such a great trip, he announced his arrival and tried to calmly introduce himself. The observer looked at the guy and asked if he was besieged on the street by that scoundrel from the Fen estate. Taking a deep breath, Ouyang again began to introduce himself, his name, who he was and where he came from, but his gag reflexes made themselves felt, and he again could not finish. The observer entered into the position of the poor student and, patting him on the shoulder, sincerely wished him good luck. His face began to turn blue and his eyes were rolling upward. He could barely restrain himself but was able to say that he would try his best. With a loud ringing sound, he hit the bronze plate. He announced the beginning of the exam. Everyone was asked to sit down in their places. Ouyang Ji was already sitting at his place. In front of him was a large sheet of paper, and in his hand he was holding a brush. He was going to give it his all, and also hoped that everything would not turn out so bad. One of the assistant examiners, holding a sign above his head, loudly announced the first topic. It was Action to the Imperial Policy of Care. Seeing such a familiar topic, Ouyang Ji's face was filled with surprise. He was in a stupor, not understanding what was happening. Looking into this topic, he mentioned Ji Fan as his teacher, and was momentarily lost in memories. The memories that came flooding back to him were of his attempts to submit an answer precisely to this topic. He carefully handed the sheet with the answer to our hero. In response, he first calmly smiled and asked if he had really finished already. But the next second, without waiting for an answer, he began to hit him with a stick again. The second guy tried to say that they had already rewritten this topic a bunch of times and that it was a little wrong. But he also failed to finish his thought, as the stick of the so-called teacher was pressed into his face, who said to stop talking nonsense, because they must continue to write all the answers that they can come up with. They must write down their best answer. The poor guys had no choice but to agree with everything Ji-fan said. He realized that our hero was taking a risk by making them repeat this question countless times, because no matter how ignorant you are in the topic, if you continue to practice it, success will follow. Shedding a tear, Ouyang-ji promised not to let his teacher down. At this time, our hero stood proudly on the roof, peering into the clear, endless sky. He looked forward with a smile on his face and said that his dear students would cope with everything. But while he was standing, 2 more people approached from behind, and one asked our hero to come down, promising that there would be no more needles, to which he categorically refused to come down. After the end of the exam, we will be transported to the pavilion in which the observers reported to His Majesty the Emperor about everything that happened. Chen Wanjiang was ordered to judge the provincial examination, and he obediently obeyed. The Emperor sat in a high place. He said that he wanted to study the list, after which it would be published. The participants would also have to wait. Everyone watching thanked His Majesty. One of them bowed and asked to add a few words. He said that he had received news that a few days ago the Imperial Guards filed a report about Feng Ji-fan, a young gentleman from the Nanhe estate, but he was rejected. It turns out he committed a crime by capturing 3 students and forcing them to worship him as their master. The Emperor was a little tense about such words. Since everyone understands how difficult learning is, their future is over because of our hero's antics. The Emperor, angry, could not believe such news that Ji-fan had done something again. He ordered that the Magistrate's Investigation Bureau be notified without fail, so that they could fully study the problem. The observer who reported such a case already imagined in his mind that as soon as the Magistrate's Investigation Bureau began its investigation, the villain of the Fen family would face nothing but punishment. Looking through the list, the Emperor expressed his opinion about the frivolity of the situation and behavior. But while he was looking at the list, something really surprised him. The Emperor asked the onlookers what they thought about Ouyang-ji, Jiang Chen, and Liu Wenshan. He was immediately informed that the 3 were scholarship holders who had fallen into the clutches of the vile, in their opinion, Feng Ji-fan. The Emperor shouted in surprise that something was not working out, and this simply could not happen. After all, in the current provincial exam, it was Ouyang-ji, Jiang Chen, Liu Wenshan who took 1st, 2nd, and 3rd places, respectively. Everyone watching as one shouted in surprise that this was simply impossible, that this could not happen. And the one who gave a report on Ji-fan's crime froze in place and thought that everything that was happening was just his bad dream. But his partner standing next to him gave him such a good spank with a scream that this was not a dream at all, and he should have woken up already. The Emperor, in a panic, began to ask whether a decree had been issued about the capture of Feng Ji-fan. Already with a swollen cheek, the beholder reports that the Emperor's decree is currently still in the lobby. Jumping up from his seat, His Majesty the Emperor, waving his hands, ordered them to immediately stop. Go and order them to stop immediately. At this time, the test results were already posted, which were looked at by a whole crowd of young guys taking it. The guys, seeing their stunning results, began to rejoice wildly, cry, scream. They simply could not believe the naturalness of what was happening. Everyone was glad to see that being above everyone else was a proud victory for them. Here our hero already approached, who with a smile on his face and pride in his voice declared that the first 3 places were taken by his wonderful students. When the guys saw him, they jumped in front of him with a lot of gratitude and rejoiced at such a victory. Rumors began to spread among the crowd that this was simply impossible. They did not believe that the young man who had gone, as they said, could teach the 3 best participants in the exam. Others said that it was all thanks to the ancestors who followed good feng shui, since nothing else could have helped him. Further events are transferred to some estate, the threshold of which the foot is crossed. Who is this? Maybe our hero. There were 2 people sitting at the table, Ji-fan's father and another old man. They were surprised by the sudden visit, and unfortunately, it was not our hero. Instead, there was a young guy in a uniform similar to the Imperial Guard. He politely greeted the lord of the Nanhe estate and Yingguo. His name is Jin Yiwei, and since he came in person, the old man immediately thought that the lord's son had arranged something again. Our hero's dad agreed with him, saying that he was 80% sure of this. He came with a message that about an hour and a half ago, a crowd had gathered near the old mansion of the Fen family. Or to be more precise, they were all madly rushing to the family tomb. He came with this message to try to prevent possible big unrest. The lord of the estate, in turn, not quite understanding the essence of what was happening, only scratched his head while thinking about what Jin Yiwei had said. The old examiner who took our hero's exam simply could not believe that the students of such a stupid person could take all the first places. It simply did not fit in his head. Grabbing Jifan's father by the clothes, he began to shout that now it was clear why a crowd was gathering at his family burial. Most likely they all thought that there was a special feng shui there. But then his mood quickly changed, and already hugging his old friend by the shoulders, he decided to ask if there was still a place left for the ancestor of his Zhang family. The lord of the estate laughed and waved his finger and thanked the old man for the reminder that people should be dispersed. Coming forward, he asked the guest to go and tell his department that he, the head of the Nanhai estate, was now obliged to them. And he himself was going to find a couple of strong guys, so that day and night they would not let anyone disturb the ancestor of his family, Fen. Then, as soon as the old man and the guest from the guard were about to leave, the father of our hero approached them from behind and hugged them tightly by the shoulders, with a joyful smile on his face, and invited them to talk to his beloved son, to which Tsang swore, and the boy did not know what to say at all. Well, let's move back to the huge, beautiful imperial palace to hear the emperor's thoughts about Feng Jifan. Looking intently at one point, His Majesty praised our hero, in particular calling him extremely talented. For the first time, he accomplished the impossible by writing a most ingenious response to the topic, Reformation of Local Lands and the Return of Former Greatness. Now a second unthinkable twist occurred. 3 of his students were able to take first place in the exam. However, everyone in the area calls him a complete fool. But turning his gaze to the side, he decided to look at his ignorant son. He sat at the table with a stupid expression on his face, chuckled quietly and flew in his dreams, imagining something strange. His Majesty the Emperor covered his eyes with his hand after such a picture, because he hired a whole bunch of famous masters for him. Absolutely everyone was a genius, a Confucius of their time, but no result came of it. And then suddenly a brilliant idea finally struck his holy head. Why he hadn't thought of this decision before. What if he can hire his child as a teacher, such an incredible person as our hero? This is indeed a rather wise decision. The emperor went as quickly as possible to the court eunuch and ordered him to get ready, because His Majesty was about to leave the palace. He was about to go to the Nanhai estate in the guise of a simple townsman. The old eunuch obediently accepted the decree and went to prepare. Before he had time to make even one more movement, a prince with burning eyes was already hanging on his shoulder, ready to go anywhere rather than study. The father emperor, barely restraining his anger, mentally dreams of hitting his son, and harder, so that his brains finally fall into place. As soon as the preparations were completed, he and several others with him set off on the road to the Nanhang estate. The door of the estate was opened by a servant. He looked at the arriving guests in surprise and asked the question who they were and what the purpose of their visit was. In front of the entrance stood an old eunuch, and behind him 6 more people. Yongwu reported that as soon as the emperor heard that the young master of the Nanhai estate had a brain disease, he sent an imperial doctor to help him. So he asked the servant to quickly warn his master. The servant, standing on the threshold as soon as he heard that the imperial doctor had arrived, immediately began to shake and say that he had arrived again. He turned around and ran inside the estates, shouting that things were bad, and there was an imperial doctor outside the gates. He kept repeating in a panic that he was here again. The news quickly reached manager Yan, who was also not particularly happy that the doctor had arrived to see them again. He immediately remembered what happened the last time the doctor came. Judging by his memories, our hero almost went crazy and ran back and forth on the roof, while the servants tried to get him down from there. He began to ask where Jifan was now. After answering that he was in the backyard, the manager ordered the big men Wang Hu and Danui to be sent. Their task was quite simple and consisted of simple protection so that their young master would not get hurt. Then he began searching for Deng Deng, who was always next to our hero. He demanded to find him so that he would lead them to the young master. Also, after the young servant was ordered to go and interview 3 fellows, since they were his students, they would agree to provide their help. 2 servants accepted this assignment. The rest were ordered to ensure that no flies landed on the roof. While there was complete chaos in the courtyard and dust stood in a column due to the incessant running around, the emperor and his entourage stood at the entrance and watched in stunned attention. The emperor had a reasonable thought, whether it was possible that everyone inside, due to panic and haste, had completely forgotten about their presence. Time flew by, and no one invited the emperor to go inside the estate. The prince was already starting to get mad, asking his father how long they should wait, because a lot of time had already passed. He said to wait a little longer. In his opinion, Feng Jifan should come out and meet him soon. A little later, when the emperor and his entourage became covered in cobwebs, and the guards watching them from afar fell asleep, the emperor could no longer bear it. He shouted loudly that if no one wanted to come out to him, then he would go in himself. While he walked inside, I proposed to see what our hero was doing, who did not come out to meet the arriving imperial doctor. He rested quietly and calmly on the couch, while a servant knelt next to him, begging him not to meet the doctor. He sobbed and apologized for the fact that they were the only ones who did not know that his illness had already been cured. They asked him to be more forward-thinking. Dungdang also added that the imperial doctor has already said that he will use needles again. He sincerely asks him not to do anything dangerous. Ouyang-ji, in turn, folded his hands and politely asked him to take care of himself, no matter what happens. Ji-fan, looking at everything that is happening, does not understand what they are doing, because at that time he behaved so simply to scare them. He decided to just lie down and rest quietly to find out what all this could lead to. By the way, about the panic, who forgot, recently the main character climbed onto the roof and the doctor and the servants thought that he wanted to throw himself off. At this time, the emperor and his escort had already reached his location. He angrily wanted to find out what they were doing while he was waiting at the entrance. But upon reaching Ji-fan's chambers, the emperor's face took on a slightly puzzled look. He most likely did not immediately understand what was happening there. In front of him were several people kneeling in front of their young master, who in turn was lying on a white sheet with his arms crossed. Someone is crying, and someone is asking for forgiveness. The prince, without hesitation, shouted loudly to the whole courtyard that he did not expect that the boy would die before he got to him. The emperor, having completely entered into the role of a doctor, shouted that he could not be frightened by such a person, and demanded to let him through, because he was ready to save his life, and could not allow him to die. But then suddenly our hero gets up and, looking at the supposed doctor with a surprised look, asks who he is and why he burst into tears for no reason at all. The emperor scratched his head and laughed nervously, apologizing for the misunderstanding. But then he remembered the reason for his coming. He shouted the name of our hero and began pointing his finger in his direction, ordering him to approach him. Ji-fan put his finger to his chin and thought that this man looked quite familiar. He saw a clear resemblance to His Majesty the Emperor, which greatly surprised him. And yes, he was not mistaken. It was the Emperor himself who came for some reason to visit our hero. He looked closely at Ji-fan and asked him a question about the location of his room, so that they could go there to conduct an examination and, if necessary, provide treatment. Our hero quickly jumped up and, saying that the previous misunderstanding was just his joke, invited him to his place. The manager ran up to him, who grabbed Ji-fan by the shoulders and began to cowardly, asking him to keep his promise. But after quickly calming down, he politely invited the emperor and his escort to go inside. Just entering the room, His Majesty immediately mentioned that he knew about the 3 students of our hero, and wanted to find out exactly how they managed to do it. Ji-fan, in the hope that he was not suspected of cheating, decided to say that he simply taught the guys at random. A little here, that's his whole secret. While the prince could barely contain his laughter in the background, the emperor threatened our hero, telling him not to take him for an idiot. Our hero, realizing that he has angered someone who should not have been angry, can only wish himself good luck. The emperor began to shout at our hero, threatening him with far from light punishment if he did not tell the whole truth. Ji-fan understood that in order to avoid problems, he must give the old emperor a satisfactory answer. At this time, the prince standing behind, unable to restrain himself, laughed loudly enough. Looking at him, Ji-fan came up with one very interesting idea in order to take revenge on the prince who gloated over him. Bowing his head, he says that there is one interesting method which he used, teaching the trio of winners. And looking up at the emperor, he voiced that this method was nothing more than assault. This answer surprised the old ruler and made him pause for a moment to think. Ji meant Fan providing this answer. In response, he told a small proverb that says that if you spare the belt, you can lose the child. According to him, you cannot leave the child to his own devices, because everything can go to waste. Next, he tells the emperor the daily schedule. First, he hung them from a tree and beat them profusely with a whip, showing no mercy. At night, they were already hung in his room, and blows were practiced on the guys, as if on a punching bag. And finally, Ji-fan gave them a break for about 2 hours so that they could rest and recover from psychological trauma. The next day, everything was repeated. The emperor listened carefully to Ji-fan's entire story and asked in surprise whether all the words he said were true. With a slight grin, our hero replied that he would not dare to lie. He also gave his word that after such actions, the student would not be able to lie or let his teacher down. After all the words, the prince's face expressed obvious anger and dissatisfaction. Apparently, the guy already knew that it was all to set him up. Ji-fan looked at the prince, noticing his irritation. The slight grin never left his face. The emperor asked with a serious look which method would be the most effective. Handing the whip to the emperor in response, Ji-fan said that it was this weapon that he used. It was also said that the sounds of his blows calm the spirit and mind. His Majesty extended his hand and calmly asked to lend him such a useful thing. Our hero said that the emperor does not need to be so polite, and he can just take it. The only condition was that Jifan was interested in who the weapon would be used on. The old ruler with a slight grin on his face said that he already had one little man in mind. After such words, the prince already understood that most likely he would be that person. Next, the emperor said that he had arrived not only on the issue of mentoring fellows. Since Jifan is the young master of the Nanhei estate, he also has a golden belt. His words and actions reflect on the reputation of the imperial court, so he should stop with all his antics. Standing opposite the guy who bowed his head, he clarifies whether he understood his words. Our hero understood that he could not make such a promise, since his appearance as a scoundrel would be destroyed. Then they might start to suspect him. Slapping his hands across his face, he forced a smile. Addressing the emperor, he says that for a young master like him, only 7 or 8 incidents a year is not a big problem. The same one, barely restraining himself, could not believe that even in such a situation our hero could argue with him. He didn't expect anything else from him. Before leaving, His Majesty, realizing that words were useless, said that he gave the right to 3 incidents, or there was no need to expect mercy. The same bowed goodbye and thanked the ruler for his instructions. Let's see what happened in the palace after the emperor and the prince returned. Standing over his son, he says that the boy has no choice but to tell the whole story to Chongguan Zongbo, from the book of rituals that he learned. The prince on his knees was afraid non-stop. He didn't know what to say and wanted to turn to his father. The emperor clarified whether he could tell or not. In response, his little son began to tearfully ask for forgiveness because he understood what awaited him. The loud cries of the poor prince, who could not learn the task, were heard throughout the entire imperial palace. The next day, a man came to our hero's house with an imperial decree. It spoke of his appointment to the position of chief of the imperial guard. His father, with a wide smile and a stream of tears, joyfully accepted the decree. Jifan stood there not understanding what was happening, because the position of head of the imperial guard was far from a joke. The imperial guard is one of the 26 security forces of the army. They are like the guards of Jinwu, who are strongest towards the royal family. The main task is to protect the royal family. Also, the position of the imperial guard represents the best opportunity for children from noble families to prove themselves. But Jifan did not understand why the emperor appointed him to such a post. Behind him, his father, waving an order, shouted that the rumors about family feng shui were true. This caused a little dissatisfaction on the part of our hero, because he wanted the father to simply praise his son's skills. The next day, the servant already brought Jifan the uniform of the Imperial Guard and asked permission to dress him. He agreed, and after a short period of time, all the clothes were already on him. There was confidence in his eyes. Our hero said that he would look stunning in absolutely any rags. The girl said with a small grin behind her hands that he really did look great. He, in turn, began to say that his name was Duty. Just as he was about to act out a pathetic speech, someone immediately interrupted him. It was a eunuch who came to remind us that our hero was late, and the cart was already waiting for him. He laughed awkwardly. Being already inside the cart, he decides to ask where they are going, because he was not provided with such information. The eunuch replied that His Majesty personally gave orders to take Jifan to the Counseling Institute on the first day of his service. Our hero asked in surprise if this was the place where the prince was sitting. The eunuch said everything was correct. He further told him that the whip that the emperor borrowed from him was used to beat the prince from head to toe, and the queen, when she found out about this, cried all night. Suddenly, Jifan's face changed, becoming more tense, so to speak. In his opinion, that institute has become a place of hell, and the blame for beating the prince is now pinned on him. Will he be able to live if he goes to the Eastern Palace? He decides to try to escape and says that he realized how young he is for such work, and it would not hurt for him to learn a little. The eunuch shouted sharply that he expected this from our hero, and ordered the cab driver to drive as hard as he could. The cart rushed with incredible speed. The old eunuch could barely keep his hat on his head. Jifan did not expect such speed, and with shouts that a person cannot rush so fast, he begged the cabman to stop. After some time, our hero was taken to a counseling institute. His foot has already crossed the threshold. He was glad that he had finally arrived, but unfortunately his joy did not last long. Leaning against the wall, he let go of everything that was inside him. Someone distracted him by asking if he remembered him. Looking towards the man who called, his eyes were filled with the deepest surprise. His Highness the Prince stood before him. All beaten and bandaged, there was no life on his face, and his gaze seemed to look into the soul itself. The prince waited a long time to meet his so-called enemy. According to him, luck has turned away from our hero. Rushing forward, he jumped and put his leg forward. He was filled with the desire to beat Jifan. Our hero stood motionless. There was no place for panic or anything like that on his face. Still unexpected, Jifan bends down, which becomes sad news for the prince. At first, His Highness did not even notice how our hero began to duck, so he was sure that he would now hit him. And then failure overtakes him. The main character knelt down to greet the prince. He, in turn, flew past. Sitting on the floor, He claims that they clearly wish him death, because failures come to him immediately after meeting Zifanim. But for some reason, surprise appeared on his face immediately after looking at our hero. A tear slowly rolled down his cheek. He said that he was glad to finally meet the prince. Strange facial expression and deliberately squeezed out tears. Our hero says that he admired him for many years. Having risen, he looked at Zifan in surprise and asked him what exactly he meant by saying that he admired him. Bowing his head, our hero replies that he has known about His Highness for a long time and was looking forward to meeting him in person. The prince looked at him intently and asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about, justifying the question by saying that most likely he did not want to get what he deserved. Looking up, Jifan said that he admired the prince because he is a wise man. In order to finally assure the prince of the veracity of his words, he begins to flatter him, saying that he is as if blessed from above. With his strong faith, he guides millions of soldiers. And that's not all. He is also skilled in horse riding and archery. But according to him, this is not the end, but only the tip of the iceberg. While the prince stands full of bewilderment, our hero continues. He believes that the prince is actually the reincarnation of an incredible martial artist. In the future, he will surely make the barbarians bow to him. In conclusion, it was said that he should rule the earth and sky like a dragon. After such a story, the prince had an incredibly happy smile on his face. But suddenly he remembered that he had not come to Dizzyfan to listen to flattery. His eyes filled with rage again. The prince shouted that he was still angry with our hero, because it was his fault that he suffered, and his anger would not subside until he got what he deserved. Suddenly, the prince became silent again, and the same surprise appeared on his face. In front was Jifan, who bowed and extended his hands in front of him, holding a large number of banknotes in them. Saying that he wants to give these modest 10,000 liang to the prince in honor of the first meeting, he holds them out closer to him. His Highness became thoughtful, because the emperor oversees his finances, and he receives only 100 liang a month. And here is such a sum, he should now call him his big brother. Pointing his finger at the money, he asked if this was all for him. As he continues to pull out the bills, he says that money is just a temporary benefit. In addition, the mutual understanding between him and the prince is much more valuable than gold. Hope flashed in the prince's eyes that Jifan could really change. But in fact, there was a nasty smile hiding behind the fan of banknotes, because initially this whole performance was planned. Jifan has carefully studied everything about the Ming dynasty and Zhuhu Zhao. Now it will be completely in his hands. While the prince and our hero are reconciling at the entrance to the institute, 4 guards near the fence are discussing how they will punish Zifan, and all because of rumors that he trampled the prince into the mud. They threw stones at him and beat him with sticks. They couldn't wait to see how he would be taught a lesson. At this time, the prince stood opposite Zifanya as about to say something, but instead of being rude, they walked up to each other with joyful laughter and held hands. Happiness was visible on their faces. The eunuchs passing by froze at the sight they saw. Everyone expected the prince to take revenge on our hero, but something went wrong. No one could have expected that unknown events would force the prince to treat Jifan as a brother, and so kindly at that. The prince, addressing our hero as a brother, offered to ride him on a horse. Jifan was not happy with this proposal, because a train with the prince on one horse would only make them look ridiculous. He urgently needed to come up with an excuse. One of the eunuchs who came recently said that the prince should not ride today. He has yet to attend a lecture. Realizing that he cannot miss the lecture, he tells Jifan that he will give him a ride after the lecture. Jifan agrees, making a sad face. But mentally, our hero breathed a sigh of relief. But one question still remains. Have to ride with the prince after the lecture? We need to come up with a plan to avoid such a fate. The 2 guards who discussed Jifan agreed that they would feel better after he got what he deserved. But suddenly the face of one of them turned pale, as if a ghost had appeared behind his friend. The second did not understand what happened to his partner's face. Behind him, Jifan was already standing, closely watching him. He decides to make his move and whispers in his ear if his friend saw him Zifanya. All the guards were very scared. They jumped away and greeted him. Our hero immediately ordered them to bring paper, wood, and a knife. He also said that they should not dare to be late. Shouting that everything would be done, they instantly evaporated to carry out the assignment. Time has passed. The prince's lecture ended. He sighed heavily once, that everything had finally come to an end. With a smile, he ordered the eunuch to find Jifan and invite him to ride a horse. The servant left to do his task. After a short period of time, our hero had already crossed the threshold of the hall in which the prince was. He joyfully ran up to him and began shouting to quickly go ride a horse. Jifan waved it off and said with complete calm in his voice that they had no need for it. The prince did not understand why his new friend was refusing, because he had agreed earlier that day. Moreover, it promised to be fun. Our hero put something tied in cloth on the table and asked His Highness to look at it. Taking off the cloth, he said that this was a military chess set that was made especially for him. On one board, you will need to manage pieces and formations in order to capture enemy ones. The prince could not contain his surprise at what he saw. Looking at the board sparkling like something out of a fairy tale, he couldn't wait to play. In fact, this was all Ji-fan's plan. Before that, he was in the library and learned about the prince's passion for military affairs. He always gets interested just from the mention of troops. Looking into the eyes of the prince, our hero offered to explain all the rules to him. His Highness, poking his finger at Ji-fan, was confident of his victory. He said that he would smash him to smithereens. The whole day went by like this. Night had already fallen, and our hero's face expressed the heaviness of what was happening. The prince clung to his leg. Ji-fan said that it was time for him to go to bed, but he said with tears in his eyes that he would go to bed only after the victory. Time flew by unnoticed. Ji-fan came to the prince every day, who constantly asked to play chess with him. He could not even imagine that as the head of the guard, he would have to play chess every day, too carefree. As soon as he stepped inside the pavilion where the prince was, he immediately heard him scolding someone. Hao Zhao kicked the eunuch because he didn't know how to play chess. This caused him great dissatisfaction. Ji-fan because he knew the level of the prince's footwork. As soon as the carefree prince noticed our hero, he decided to immediately call him, as he had come up with a new win-win strategy. The eunuch interrupted him and said that now was not the time for games, because he had to attend the lecture. Otherwise, a certain sage, Yan, would give him a punishment. The prince had no intention of going anywhere. He told the eunuch that he would convey about the sudden illness that struck him. Ji-fan, who watched this from the side, understood that since this stupid kid was the future emperor of the Ming dynasty, all this entertainment and absenteeism could no longer continue. So he decides to tell Hu Zhao that he doesn't want to play chess anymore. He's tired of it. The prince immediately put on a serious face and asked if Ji-fan really didn't want to be friends with him anymore. But he was prepared, and in response to the question, he invited him to play a game. The prince, like a small child, lit up after just the mention of the game. Ji-fan says that playing chess in itself is quite boring, and offers to place bets. If he loses, he will give up 300 liang. Hu Zhao agreed to these conditions, and also added that if he lost, he would give the same amount. But our hero was not satisfied with such a proposal. He approached the prince and asked if he really thought that he had no money. The prince, spreading his arms, asked what Ji-fan wanted from him, since he did not need money. Looking straight into the eyes of his opponent, our hero says that if he loses, he will have to learn one topic. Hao Zhao looked at Ji in confusion. Fanya doesn't know what to answer. Our hero grinned and asked directly if it was possible that the prince was afraid of losing. Although tense, the prince agreed, because he must not retreat or give up. After that moment, Ji-fan loved his job as the head of the guard. Waking up early in the morning, he immediately went to his post. Hu Zhao usually attended his lectures at the institute, or pretended to be sick. He spent the rest of the time with our hero, playing chess and studying. Sometimes Ji-fan even had to admit that the emperor's bloodline was not that bad. All because Hu Zhao had an excellent memory. Sometime later, one early morning, when Ji-fan was getting ready for his post. But a servant came to his room with a report that the master had heard rumors about special politeness with others. So he called a doctor just in case. Our hero, saying that he was completely healthy, dealt a sudden, strong blow right to the face of his servant. The poor servant was thrown into the wall with such force that it began to crack. Despite all the pain after such a blow, he proudly declared that he vouched for the stable state of his master's health. Having said that he was leaving for service, he gave the last instruction to drive that doctor to hell. But suddenly his father stood in front of him and asked him not to get excited. He had a question for him. He heard that our hero recently took 50,000 liang in silver from the family treasury. He wondered if he had any left. Ji-fan began to list that at first he gave about 30,000 to the prince as pocket money. Then he lost a little to him in chess. After thinking a little, he came to the conclusion that he had spent everything. The old man had no words. His heart skipped a beat after hearing that all 50,000 had been spent. The head of the estate, realizing that his child had again entered prodigal son mode, began coughing up blood. This became a major stress for him. Shedding a tear, he mentally said that the money was needed for one very important event. But we still do not know what this event was. Ji-fan arrived at his post, where His Highness the Prince was already waiting for him. With a wide smile, he began poking his fingers at his friend, shouting that he had been up all night waiting for him. All this was just to play chess. Our hero warned him that firstly it was too early, and secondly, he should go to a lecture at the institute, since the sage Yan was already waiting. But the prince said that he was not going to go anywhere, because he had already ordered the eunuch Liu to tell the sage that he was not feeling well. Then he put his hand to Ji-fan's throat and said that he was going to deal with him. Ji-fan confidently said that he would attack. Several hours passed. All this time the guys were playing chess carefree. Our hero, having decided to warm up, noticed that everything around him had become somehow quiet. His attention was attracted by someone's appearance standing to the side. A rather familiar man stood behind the curtain and carefully watched everything that was happening. Having looked a little closer, The imperial clothes became noticeable. Ji-fan couldn't believe it was true. Yes, it was the Hongzhi emperor who watched for who knows how long. His gaze seemed to look into the soul. He did not understand what the emperor was doing there. He was tormented by the question of who called him, and also why no one announced his presence. While His Highness was thinking about his next move, our hero understood that most likely, they would soon be in trouble. The prince, shouting that he had demolished the enemy commander, began to jump with happiness. He urged Ji-fan to make his move, but he bowed his head and began to shake and quietly mumble that he was greeting His Majesty. It's a pity the prince didn't pay attention to this, and began to tell how his father turns silky when he sees his wife. The emperor calmly listened as his son continued to talk about his obedience to the empress. One day, when he wanted to punish the prince, his mother screamed and he had to let him go. Ji-fan began to shake even more strongly, and he greeted the emperor with punctuation and wished him long life. But the prince still did not believe him. Moving forward, he asked the question, does Ji-fan really want to distract him so much as to change the pieces on the board? Just as he wanted to say that he wouldn't be fooled like that, something caught his eye. In a moment, horror appeared in his eyes. Standing in front of him is the father emperor. The poor guy began to pray to his ancestors for salvation. The ruler looked intently at his son. He said that he found time to come and see the sick baby, but to his surprise, he was quite energetic. The prince understood that severe punishment awaited him, so he could not say a single word. The emperor left the guys with the words that he was waiting for both of them in the temple hall, because this place would be cramped for such a conversation. Ji-fan and Hu Zhao looked at each other silently. Both understood that they could not get off with a simple punishment. Immediately after the emperor left, a panicked eunuch Liu ran into the room. The prince immediately grabbed him by the clothes. He started insulting and asking why his father was here and why he didn't tell him anything. Being in a panic, he is sure that he will be in trouble. The emperor will definitely beat him again. All frightened, the guy orders the eunuch to go to his mother's palace and tell him that her son is in danger. Thicker Hanfu was also requested to cushion the fall. They were interrupted by Ji-fan, who told them to wait one moment. Maybe he was about to say something important. The eunuch and the prince looked at him in disbelief. They did not understand the reason for this behavior. But to their surprise, our hero, bending down, asked to grab his clothes too because they definitely wouldn't be superfluous. The emperor was already in the temple hall along with Sage Yan. They were waiting for the guys to show up for a conversation, but for some reason their faces were distorted with incredibly strong surprise. What did they see? The emperor looked at the guys menacingly and addressed them with a serious question, which meant wondering if they were cold. In front of him stood our hero and prince in a thick layer of clothing. They looked like serious cabbage heads. The emperor looks closely at the two guys and wonders if autumn is really so cold that he would wear so many clothes at once. The prince, still trembling, answers that he is sick and the wind outside is very strong. The emperor gives the order to both of them to quickly undress. The guys looked at each other with fear in their eyes. One of the servants approached Zifan Yu and slowly began to undress him. As soon as he pulled off the first layer of clothing, there was another one underneath. He looked at our hero in surprise, not quite understanding what and why. He looked back at the servant, as if saying that there was nothing wrong with this. The guy reached out to pull off the next layer, but failed again. After all, there were clothes underneath again. The only thing that changed was its color. Again, a strange misunderstanding look from the servant, and an almost calm, oncoming look from Zifan. The servant began to quickly pull off our hero's clothes. Layer after layer it lay on his hands, but there was no end to it. Jifan's clothes, the tired guy sighed with relief. Next was the prince. As soon as the layers of his clothes began to run out, the servant's attention was attracted by something behind His Highness's bosom. The item suddenly fell out, causing both of them to feel tense. It turned out to be a steel plate, which fell to the floor with a characteristic roar. Jifan's eyes were filled with sincere surprise. Apparently, the prince is really afraid of blows from his father. Despite this situation, our hero was surprised by the prince's calmness. Apparently, he was already ready for this. But the prince immediately after his calm began to justify himself that that plate belonged to one of his servants. Most likely she came to him by mistake. Was not satisfied with this excuse, and he ordered silence, accompanying the order with a loud bang on the table. He was furious because he knew that his son was simply lying and stalling for time, trying to get away from his responsibilities. This did not stop there. He called all the actions of the prince a simple exercise in bullshit. The emperor continued to shout that he always considered the prince. When he got sick, he didn't sleep all night. When it came to training, the best masters always came. But the same one did not make any effort. The next one to receive a scolding was our hero. His Majesty said that he had a better opinion of him, but all he did was play for days on end. Pointing his hand at the guys, he added that he knew that nothing good would come of their being together. The prince was already sweating because he understood that now they would most likely be completely finished. But Ji-fan did not want to accept such a fate, and interrupted the emperor by saying that his conclusions were too quick. Those standing next to the emperor opened their mouths in surprise. Such words towards the emperor were complete disrespect. Looking menacingly at our hero, he asked what was wrong with his conclusions. Bowing, Ji-fan says that he made a mistake in his conclusions, and in fact, His Highness the Prince is not such an ignoramus. Hearing such a statement, the emperor asked if our hero considered him a fool, and then ordered them to be hanged. Ji-fan did not expect this, and he also could not object, because as soon as he started talking about injustice, he would immediately be reminded of his past deeds. Straining his brain more and more, he tried to figure out how to resolve the whole situation before it was too late. And then a brilliant idea comes to him. He turns to the prince and asks what he has learned so far. Putting his finger to his head, Hu Jiao began to tell everything he had learned without a single hesitation. Seijian was shocked. He never expected such an achievement from the prince. The emperor also had no words. His Majesty listened, realizing that this was the very topic that his son did not want to learn. But now he knew it by heart. And Ji-fan stood grinning at that time because all this was the merit of his idea. Having finished retelling what he had learned, the prince added at the end that this was all he had learned. His Majesty the Emperor was stunned. His son was indeed able to recite Mengzi word for word. What surprised him most was that usually he could only superficially learn a book and then forget it. In the past, he didn't even know the author of the Book of Rituals, and now the words from Mengzi are bouncing off his teeth. After coughing several times, the emperor asked what the topic he had retold wanted to say. But the prince answers without hesitation that the topic is needed to explain the shortage of food and clothing. After such an answer, the emperor opened his mouth, because this was not banal memorization, but indeed knowledge of the topic. Sage Yan also opened his mouth, not understanding how it was even possible for His Highness to learn everything. But the prince was not going to stop at such an answer, and added that, in his opinion, what was written there was only a superficial explanation. There are also two more morals hidden inside. According to him, ruling the world is difficult, and the emperor must take into account everyone's opinion, because only then can he find the right solution. But the emperor loudly slammed the table, interrupting the prince's speech. The guy was very scared that he might have made a mistake somewhere, and now his father would beat him again. But the emperor only laughed loudly, saying that his son was still talented. Mentally, he said that the prince was completely right, because the book described the main rules of government. The emperor slowly approached Sage Yan, which greatly frightened and surprised him at the same time. Since he bowed to him expressing gratitude, the old man's heart sank. He immediately fell to his knees and began beating his head on the floor, saying that he didn't need any praise. The emperor said with a slight smile that he entrusted his son to him, and he was trained with proper professionalism. Addressing the old man, he says that he was able to fulfill his teaching duty. But Sage Yan began to shout that he was a sinner worthy only of death, because he did not teach Prince Mengzi. His Majesty, having heard such news, turned sharply towards his son, looking at him with eyes that did not understand anything. The same one, pointing his finger to the side, directly said that he was taught by Feng Jifan. After the prince's words, everyone in the hall was in indescribable shock. No one could believe that the prince was taught by someone like our hero, and they couldn't be sure that he himself was capable of anything. Jifan at this moment wondered how best to answer. If he is modest, the old people may suspect something. With a smile, he calmly said that everything was correct, and he really helped him a little. At first, the emperor continued to be in a slight stupor, but this did not last long. After saying that the Fan family is worthy of praise, he asks how he could force the prince to learn such a complex topic. This question put Ji-fan in the worst possible position. He could not say that he played with the prince for money every day, and that he learned every time he lost. Unexpectedly, the emperor asked the next question, touching on the same method that was used on the students: violence. Ji-fan seemed to be struck by lightning. He could not afford to raise his hand against the prince, but he also did not know how to respond in such a deadlock situation. And then the prince comes to his aid, who tells his father that he actually had to go through a lot of hardships. But everything is fine. Our hero clearly did not expect such a serious setup from his new friend. And the emperor was not particularly pleased with this answer, and he pointed his fingers at the framed guy and asked if he knew that violence against the royal family is a crime. Ji-fan, accepting his fate, could not say anything. His only thoughts were only doubts that he could survive. The emperor scolded our hero, saying that everything has its own laws and foundations. He was interested in whether he knew that there is a prince, and there is his servant. So can a servant contradict the monarch? He asked a question. Ji-fan replied that of course he couldn't because it was a crime. Also with trepidation in his voice, he added that His Majesty should not destroy the bridge after crossing the river. Sage Yan wanted to say that our hero is still young, so we shouldn't treat him so cruelly, but he couldn't do anything about it. The prince thought that since his father was fed up with everything that was happening, This time his friend would definitely be finished. He wanted to say something, to force the words out of himself, to help Zifan. But the emperor silenced his son with just one word, and he was unable to influence anything. Seijian also thought that although the emperor expressed his dissatisfaction, if in all seriousness he accused our hero of treason, then there would be trouble. Therefore, he decides to speak out to try to somehow rectify the situation. But he did not want to listen to anyone, but simply quoted the words of Zifan about the bridge after crossing the river. After which he began to shout again, how dare he slander him. He reminded him that the prince was a monarch, and he was a simple servant, and had no right to beat him. Having finished his instructive monologue, His Majesty gave the order to bring him a sword. After hearing such words, our hero accepted his unfortunate fate. The prince began to cry with thoughts of hope that in the next life they would remain brothers. After a short period of time, the servant delivered the sword to the emperor. Seijian did not know what could be done. The situation seemed to be out of control. Jifan stood there, sweating, all tense. There was hope for mercy in his thoughts because this was his first mistake. While everyone was silent, the emperor calmly took the sword in his hands and slowly began to move towards our hero. Servant stood behind him. Jifan had already completely sweated out from the tension. He became more and more afraid with each new step of the emperor. Although it was an honor to die at the hands of Hongzhi himself, our hero did not want this. He came up with the idea to start playing the insane again, because the emperor was unlikely to lynch such a person. His Majesty was already standing opposite, and the guy wanted to start performing his performance. Slowly, the emperor began to raise the hand in which he was holding the sword. Jifan could not utter a word. He was enveloped in fear and had no choice but to accept his fate. To his surprise, instead of a fatal blow, the emperor held out the sword in front of him, as if saying that he would accept it. He said that our hero is a fool, because trying to harm the prince is a crime against the prince, but not the emperor. Handing over the sword, the emperor added that with this sword, any action with the prince would be considered his will. Thus, there are no prohibitions for him, and the law is also not scary for him. His Majesty asked that he teach his son with all seriousness and rigor. The last instruction was to order the Feng family to give the prince a good beating. Seijian smiled lightly with peace of mind, and thought that after all, the emperor was always fair and prudent. The prince, watching all this, shed a tear, and thoughts were spinning in his head that he had disappointed his son so much that he wanted to end his mortal life as quickly as possible. Having accepted the sword and bowed to the emperor, Jifan promised to make every effort to fulfill his will in the best possible way. The prince, seeing such a picture, began to feel that most likely he would not see a wonderful future. And then, unexpectedly for everyone, Her Highness the Empress arrives along with the princess, a lady of incredible beauty, dressed in the best clothes and with a beautiful crown on her head. Behind stands the princess and several eunuchs. The prince, with tears in his eyes, rejoiced at the arrival of his mother. He immediately threw himself into her arms to save his carcass from beatings and all that. Jifan was surprised because this was his first time seeing the queen alive. The emperor also did not expect her visit. The empress, in her soft voice, asked her son how he had angered his father again, and whether he had apologized. Looking askance at his father, he said that he did not make him angry. Hearing the answer, his mother told him that it was good if that was the case, and since he was free, he needed to go to his grandmother. The emperor stood and could not object to the words of his wife. Our hero simply had no words after what he saw. Not only does the empress address the prince by his nickname, but the Hongzhi emperor is afraid to even utter a word. Having straightened the clothes on her son, she clarified whether he was definitely free, and if so, then they should hurry. The prince looked at his father with such a look as if he was obliged to let him go immediately, and the emperor had no choice but to say that he was free, and could go to the Renshu palace in order to honor his grandmother with a visit. The same one with a smile on his face said that he was listening and obeying. Jifan at this time thought that such a woman really deserved to be the wife of the emperor. Well, immediately after all the thoughts, his attention was attracted by the princess. A young girl, very beautiful, her eyes sparkle and her skin looks incredibly smooth. She noticed our hero's gaze on her and decided to look back. At first she was even scared because a normal person wouldn't stare at a stranger so intently. Having calmed down, she wondered who he was to continue staring at her so indecently. Spontaneously, our hero begins his movement towards the young princess. As he approached, she began to worry more and more, because she did not know who he was and why he was heading in her direction. When he approached almost point blank, she mentally began to scream that he should not dare to approach her. But unexpectedly, he simply leaned over and turned to her. The emperor and empress were also attracted by this gesture, and they carefully watched what would happen next. Most likely, he wanted to say something banal, but to everyone's surprise, Jifan said that Her Highness looked pale and she should take care of her health. The princess was a little alarmed by this, and she thought that most likely the guy was not all at home. But why did he say this? In fact, he was reading a book that had one entry. It said that the Hongzhi emperor had a daughter, but she died before reaching adulthood. Records say she suffered from a severe headache and died of high fever. Modern experts believe that her illness was most likely a simple viral disease. Jifan, believing that by warning her he can change the future, wishes her to be healthy. But the princess still continued to believe that our hero had problems with his head. Well, the prince, looking at all this, began to worry, because no matter how elegant and self-willed he is, but even he better not behave like that in such a place and environment. After our hero's words, the empress, although dissatisfied, remains silent, pondering where such an impudence came from. The prince, noticing this, asks her not to be angry and comes closer to her. Then he tells her in her ear that in fact Zifan suffers from a brain disease. Now she absolutely understands his behavior. Since he is simply abnormal, she will not punish him. Approaching him, she calmly tells him not to forget to take care of himself, because mental illness is very serious. A prince passing by put his hand on Zifan's shoulder and said that they would see each other again. Everyone went about their business. The servants left in a hurry for fear of getting infected, but the emperor, on the contrary, took his time, so as not to break his back again. Although it was a little offensive, it still has its advantages. No one would care about a crazy fool like our hero. After everything that happened, he was finally home. But before he could cross the threshold, another problem appeared before him. Apparently, he won't see any rest. His father cried that people from Shuning and Jianchang were coming, and this was very, very bad. They used the name of the royal family with malicious intent. As a result, our hero's father was fooled for 30,000 silver liang. They assured him that he should come to Queen Zhang's palace and act as matchmaker for their daughter, even insisting that it was his responsibility as a father. As a result, they seriously misled the old man, and now he owes them 30,000 liang. From all this, Jifan highlighted what his father thought about his marriage. The old man continued to cry about how much his heart hurt at the mention of that amount. And while his tears were flowing in a stream, Zifan, passing by, said that it was just a trifle, and he should stop crying in front of everyone like a little child. From this moment on, he takes these worries upon himself. Our hero, with a smile on his face, mentally says that he will pay a visit to those who had the courage to steal his money, and he will figure it out using his own methods. During the Hongzhi period, weather suddenly occurred that could be compared to the Little Ice Age. The temperature dropped sharply, and heavy snowfalls began. According to information known to our hero, it will snow for half a year, but it's already quite cold outside. In such weather, growing crops becomes problematic. Famine among the people was one of the main reasons for the fall of the Ming dynasty. Our hero was pulled out of his thoughts by the cry of a servant who brought him a container of hot coals. These coals were delivered in the morning by manager Yan. The servant also told his young master that recently the price of coal had skyrocketed. Now it costs 80 coppers per kilogram. Jifan was surprised by the price and said that it was a robbery in broad daylight. This price is abnormal. But despite this price is actually completely justified. During this era, when the rich used charcoal, people with modest finances made do with burnt wood. Since extracting charcoal is a very long process, the products of its combustion are almost not dangerous to humans. That's why it became the choice of the rich. Firewood in turn burns easily, but the smoke from it makes breathing very difficult and is unsafe for health. Why doesn't anyone use anthracite? Our hero thought about this. Anthracite contains very little sulfur, and like fossil coal, contains relatively pure carbon. It burns without color, emitting small amounts of fire and smoke. It also takes a long time to burn. It is an excellent heating fuel. Our hero knows where to get it. The main source is located in Shanxi and only one in the capital. For Jifan, this seemed like an incredible opportunity. He asks his servant what he knows about Western Mountain, Jishan. He also orders him to go find out who it belongs to, but he immediately answers our hero's questions. The mountain belongs to the Shuning estate and the Jianchang estate. The whole capital knows about this. Jifan was surprised that the unfortunate Zhang family appeared on his way again. If he wants, those 100% will set an exorbitant price. It was these two who defrauded his father of 30,000 liang in silver. But he doesn't care because Sishan is a treasure. On the surface and in the depths it is full of minerals. Millions of homes need fuel for heating. Therefore, the owner of the mountain can be called the owner of the cornucopia. Leaving his house, he gives instructions to the servant to go to the treasurer and take money from him. He set out on the road to negotiate the purchase of his future source of profit. The servant of the two old men came with a report that some guy wanted to meet them, and he was waiting at the entrance. Both of them asked in surprise who exactly came to them. The servant said it was from the nanny estate. As soon as the old people heard this, they immediately said to drive the visitor to hell. They thought that it was the father of our hero who had come, and did not want to see him, because he had already come several times and begged for his money. But the servant said that this was not the lord of the Nanhe estate, but his notorious son, the fornicator Feng Jifan. Both old men were quite surprised and decided that he could pass. All dressed up in winter clothes, our hero steps through the threshold. After his appearance, he immediately introduces himself. He is their nephew from the younger generation of Feng Jifan, and he finally decided to come up to them and introduce himself. One of them asks whether he correctly understands that the guy came to them not for his father's money, but with his own goals. With an absolutely indifferent face, he points his finger behind himself and says that he came to buy land from them, namely Mount Sishan. The old man's heart sank at such joyful news, and he immediately clarified whether his beautiful nephew was deceiving him. In the eyes of the old man, our hero looked like nothing more than a small, stupid spender. Thinking that the guy doesn't know how to spend money wisely, he immediately voices that he has nothing to do here if he hasn't taken at least 200,000 liang of silver with him. The second old man was proud of his brother, because he stood his ground and set the price for a worthless piece of land at 200,000. But our hero is not afraid, and he agrees to the conditions. But there is one thing. Right now he can only pay 50,000. Either that, or he leaves. From the beginning, the old man was surprised that there was a crazy person who was going to pay 50,000 for a wasteland. You won't be able to grow anything on that mountain. But then he still continued to stand his ground, that the minimum price was 100,000. There is, of course, the possibility of a 10,000 discount due to good relations with his family. True, our hero did not even listen to the end, and turned around and prepared to leave their estate. The old man got scared and began to ask Ji-fan to stop, because they could still discuss the price. Nevertheless, they inherited that land. The fact is that in addition to 14 li in a radius, although all of it is made up of mountains, there is a village at the foot. This turns out to be at least 1,000 mu, and he is ready to give all this for 80,000 liang. But besides all this, there is another important question, namely how much money Ji-fan took with him. Our hero, turning in his direction, calmly replied that he did not have that much cash with him. At first, the old man sadly mentioned that since he had no money, he decided to just come and pick his brains. Everything was almost like this. If you don't take into account that Ji-fan brought papers with him to the lands, all of them are fertile. He also has several precious banknotes with him. Both brothers jumped with happiness. They had such a great opportunity so spontaneously. As they saw off Ji-fan, the old people shouted after him that they admired him and that he would come and see them again someday. Our hero was full of enthusiasm. Since he has dealt with Xishan, everyone should carefully watch how he gets rich. And his servant cried, cursing those old people. Even despite his master's illness, his habit of thoughtlessly spending money remained. Although he feels sorry for all those lands, he still does not know the full value of Xishan. While our hero was on his way home, a full examination of Her Highness the Princess was carried out in the imperial court. The emperor told the empress that although Ji-fan sometimes says smart things, sometimes he tends to talk nonsense, which should not be overthought. But Her Majesty still insists on a full examination, since after our hero's words, her eye did not stop twitching. Despite the fact that the guy may talk nonsense, both majesties will be calmer if the doctor examines the princess. The doctor who conducted the examination finished and approached the royal highnesses and reported that their phoenix was completely healthy. The empress once again clarified whether everything was fine and whether any checks were required. Bowing, the doctor said that you shouldn't listen to some arrogant young man. He was talking complete nonsense, and the doctor himself guarantees that there are no problems. After making sure that everything was fine, the imperial family released the doctors. The empress, turning to her husband, says that Feng Jifan really turned out to be obnoxious and too talkative. But the emperor replies that she might not know. But the young master of the Nanhe estate has problems with his head. His habits do not depend on himself. She also doesn't have to worry about punishing him. After listening to her husband, the empress said that in this case, the Nanhe estate could only be pitied. Their conversation was interrupted by screams calling for the princess, as if something had happened to her. Both his and Her Majesty's faces were instantly filled with surprise. Arriving at the room, they were told that Her Highness had lost consciousness and no one knew what was happening. Addressing the doctor, the emperor asks what he can say in his defense. Unable to stand the silence, he begins to shout, so that he would rather say something than do it. But the old man only made excuses that she was healthy a moment ago, but then suddenly lost consciousness. He and other doctors concluded that Her Highness might have caught a cold. The empress thought about what was happening, and could not understand what happened to her daughter, who a moment ago was healthy. And then a moment emerges in her memory when our hero asks the princess to take care of her health. At the top of her lungs, the empress immediately orders that Ji-fan be found and brought to her. At this time, Ji-fan had just reached the threshold of his house, glad that everything was over. His plans were to drink hot tea and then lie down to rest under a cozy blanket. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, all his plans instantly collapsed. Instantly, the guards of the imperial court grabbed him by the arms, saying that Her Majesty ordered him to be brought to the palace. They quickly threw our hero into the cart without even explaining anything. They threw it in such a hurry that our hero lost consciousness when he hit the wall of the cart. The cart quickly went beyond the horizon. Not everyone can demonstrate such speed. Already in the imperial palace, Jifan stood opposite the princess, who had come down with illness. His memory did not fail him. She really could have easily died. The empress, in a panic, asked if he knew what happened to her dear daughter. Jifan replied that to answer he needed to examine her highness in more detail. Although in a little confusion, the emperor gave his permission, because perhaps our hero may turn out to be the last hope. Jifan quickly sat down opposite the princess, throwing the two doctors to the sides. The old doctor, turning to Jifan, also wants to know what disease her highness is suffering from. The old man stood behind our hero all the time. He was sure that such a kid could not know what the princess was suffering from. Although Jifan knew what she was suffering from, he could not say, because no one would understand what a viral disease is anyway. A simply brilliant idea came into his head, and he made it clear to everyone that he knew what illness the princess was suffering from. Everyone was surprised and listened carefully to what our hero would say. But to everyone's surprise, instead of some specific disease, Jifan called it a brain disease without raising an eyebrow. Everyone's hopes were instantly dashed. No one believed in our hero's conclusion. The old doctor seemed to have broken free and began to shout that the guy was taking him for an idiot, because the princess's illness was in no way similar to a brain disease, and in general, it could not cause such a fever in the patient. With all this, Jifan didn't even measure his pulse, so why did he draw such conclusions? But our hero said with a smile that he had been studying brain diseases for 10 years, and could recognize the diagnosis at first sight. The old man was already beginning to lose his temper, since the guy had neither shame nor conscience. He says that as someone who has lived for just over 2 decades, he can say that he's been studying brain diseases for 10 years. But Jifan sharply replies that the old man does not understand anything. Remembering how countless needles were inserted into his head, he is sure that he really taught. The old man doesn't understand how he could teach something so serious. Almost in all seriousness, our hero declares that there is a long-term treatment for this. Then the emperor appears and shouts at Jifan that now is not the time or place for jokes. But he with a stupid face says that the emperor should think 10,000 more times before saying whether he really can be ignorant. His Majesty closes his eyes, realizing that it is our hero who is the most hopeless of all. The empress had already begun to cry, not knowing what to do. Her poor girl. Jifan looked at her and was surprised, because she kept her face in any situation. When it comes to your child, not everyone can behave calmly. He shouts loudly for paper and ink to be brought to him as quickly as possible. As soon as everything was delivered, our hero began to write down the recipe, because he knew that the Ming dynasty would be able to get all the medicine. Having finished writing, Jifan handed the recipe to the old doctor so that he could start preparing it. The old man, peering at the recipe, decides to ask how he can prepare such medicine. But Jifan said that he didn't know, so he would have to figure it out himself. The old man began to bleed from anger. In his opinion, such a brat is only a disgrace to the entire world of healing. The emperor sighed heavily, slowly beginning to lose all hope. But Jifan approached him, saying that he wrote the recipe in all seriousness, and he could cure the princess. His Majesty agreed to check everything and trust our hero. He did a good job. While leaving the palace, Jifan mentioned that this was the first time he had seen the Hongzhi emperor in such a depressed state. Several days have passed already. It was deep night outside. The moon illuminated the palace. The emperor, turning to his wife, says that she should rest, since she has not slept for more than 100 hours. He says that there is a belief in which heaven always helps the worthy, and everything always ends well. But Her Majesty was disturbed by the words of the doctors, who said that Jifan was not a doctor, and his treatment was almost 100% likely to not help. The emperor was angry with those doctors who simply talk nonsense and don't know anything. He would like his poor daughter's illness to pass on to him. He was ready to take on all her hardships. The empress just continued to cry quietly, waiting for the results of the treatment. But then one of the servants comes running, shouting that Her Royal Highness the Princess has woken up. The empress, who had almost lost all hope, began to beam with happiness. The old doctor shouted that this was simply incredible, and the princess really had a brain disease. There was nothing like this in the books. He concluded that after a long illness, people become more knowledgeable than doctors who have studied medicine for decades. Our hero was at home, but his quiet time was interrupted by a servant who came to report that Lao Tsang had arrived and wanted to see him. Hearing such a familiar name, Jifan was filled with excitement and fear. Most likely that old man will mock him again. He constantly tries to beat him up. His decision settled on the option of wearing something thicker before going to that old villain. Without thinking twice, he first went to look for clothes, leaving behind the spoiled snowman. Meanwhile, old man Zhang was already shouting at our hero's father, saying that yesterday he received an invitation from the Shuning and Jianchan couple. They told him that they were able to sell a piece of wasteland for a lot of money, and that wasteland was bought by the Feng family for 80,000 liang in silver. He wonders what the point was in buying Shishan, Ji-fan could have made such an absurd exchange. The protagonist's father says that it doesn't matter anymore because what's done is done. The land can always be changed, even if it is a small wasteland. But the old man interrupts him again, saying that it has long been announced that there is nothing on Sishan. Therefore, no one bought it. But our hero specifically came to the old people for that land. The father replies that Ji-fan earned that money himself, and even if he hadn't earned it, he has every right to it. But the annoying old idiot doesn't care and says we need to get ready. Therefore, we should hurry up and find a wife for our hero. The protagonist's father replies that his son is already serving in the royal guard and has a wonderful future ahead of him. However, the old man still says that the emperor is a noble and lenient ruler, and his son is a complete laughingstock, known to the entire capital. Someone like him will never be promoted. Our dad has already begun to cry because he continues to be blamed for his inability to raise his son. Lao Tsang approached him and put his hand on his shoulder, saying that this was not his fault. Everything should be blamed on Ji-fan. Then he shouted sharply why our hero had not yet appeared. Most likely, he simply realized that if he passes, nothing good will happen to him. But in fact, the main character was already standing outside the door and he was wearing a bunch of clothes. Hearing the phrase that if he doesn't come, that old man will personally visit him and break his legs. Knowing that in his youth the old man was a genius in several fields, including Chinese martial arts, it was decided that going there would be pure suicide. Tsang looked out from around the corner of the door, saying that he had finally found our hero. Having noticed him, Ji-fang immediately began to run away, shouting that he was glad to see his uncle. But he had important work and he had to go. But the old man did not lag behind him and began to quickly catch up with our poor hero, who was running with all his might. Unfortunately, the escape failed, because the next moment the old man Tsang's hand was already on Ji-fan's shoulder. Quickly putting the guy on the ground, he asked if he had the last word. Looking at the evil old man, Ji-fan's only thoughts were farewell to the beautiful world. But the important conversation was interrupted by a servant, who ran in a panic to report that the emperor and empress had arrived, accompanied by a huge crowd. Lao Zhang's face at this moment was simply impossible to describe. Such a strong surprise is rarely seen. His and her royal majesties said they were only there for a short time. Noticing the old man Zhang, the emperor said that since he was here, the Nanhai estate should be very cozy. Lao Zhang, kneeling, reflected that his majesty had never visited his palace, but came to Nanhai. The protagonist's father jumped up and asked what happened, that the imperial family came to them. Both he and Lao Tsang bowed and greeted the emperor and empress, wishing them long life. Ji-fang also bowed and greeted only the empress, but she asked him to get up and said that there was no need to be so polite, because they had come to him. Old man Tsang was surprised that even the empress called our hero by name. The empress announces that she has come to thank our hero for everything he has done, because thanks to him the princess survived and the treatment went smoothly. Ji-fan awkwardly scratched his head, saying that it was not worth it, and he did what he had to do. Lao Zhang was shocked that the boy dared to answer Her Majesty in such a manner. He's clearly pushing himself, and the father was very glad that his son saved the life of Her Highness. He considered it simply incredible luck. The empress asked everyone not to be so formal and to stand up. Our dad thanked her. She turned to him saying that the Nanhai estate raised a wonderful child. After listening to the praise, the gentleman apologized for the rudeness, as well as the arrogant behavior of his son. The empress replied that there was no need to apologize. His son is a man of honor. Even if he was guilty, she decided to accept his son as her nephew, and with that, she forgives him. Our hero's father simply exploded from such a statement. He did not believe that the empress would accept Ji-fan as a nephew. The greatest success awaited him. Old man Tsang was also surprised. He did not understand whether there was even a limit to what was happening here. He looked at Ji-fan and continued to blink madly, so that he would quickly say that he was not worthy of such a great honor. Our hero felt this crazy gaze on himself and decided to look at the old man. He continued to gesticulate madly while looking at him. Ji-fan thought about what to do in such a situation. He barely saved his life, and is now on his nerves, and now the old man wants him to show respect to the empress. And this goes against our stupid Ji-fan. They decided what would be the best thing for him to do, so as not to lose his status. Our hero knelt before the empress, bowing to the floor. Both she and the emperor were surprised, and old man Zhang breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that the guy still had a conscience. But unfortunately for the old man, Ji-fan took a breath with a grin and prepared to start speaking. He began to say that at this very moment, nephew Ji-fan pays tribute to his aunt. Everyone in the area had no words. They just stood silently and looked at him. Poor old man Lao Zhang had a drop of blood leak out of his mouth. Most likely from that moment on, he began to hate him even more. Despite all the disrespect, the empress took Ji-fan by the hands and calmly said that from now on, he should call her aunt. If someone offends him, he can come and tell her everything. The emperor, covering his face, asked them to stop all these pleasantries. Then he asked our hero to come to his office as they should discuss an important matter. As soon as the door was closed, His Majesty asked whether the princess would be able to fully recover. Only Ji-fan was about to answer, calling himself his nephew. The emperor interrupted him, ordering him to stop calling himself nephew. Since he still serves the emperor, he is not allowed to break the chain of command. A little upset, Ji-fan continued to say that in his opinion, the princess should have recovered from her illness by now, and the emperor should not worry. The questions continued. His Majesty further inquired whether the princess really suffered from a brain disease, and also whether the medicine that was prescribed could actually cure the disease. Ji-fan, full of confidence, replies that there was indeed a brain disease, and everything was fine with his medicine. And then the emperor notices that since his treatment results in such a quick recovery, then why does he himself still need so many procedures? Our hero had no answer to this, and for a moment he fell into a stupor. He did not know how to explain why and for what reason he was still being treated, only he began to think about the answer. How the emperor interrupted him. He suggested that the root of the disease was not so easy to get rid of, and he should tell it like it really is. The thought came to our hero's head that this is the very situation that forces people to lie. Bowing, he said that His Majesty is very perceptive and always looks into the very heart. The emperor asked if the princess needed another examination. Ji-fan replies that you should always be prepared for possible complications. Having heard such an answer, the emperor gave the order that since our hero is now serving at the university, the princess will regularly visit him for the purpose of timely treatment. With a smile on his face, Ji-fan says that it will be a great honor for him to follow his cousin. The emperor angrily shouted at him, telling him not to forget that he would have to watch her constantly. After such a cry, our hero quietly said that it would be a great honor for him to treat the illness of Her Royal Highness. The emperor asked the next question, "What are the signs that the disease is returning?" To which I received the answer that everything was exactly the same as with our hero. Now he is stupid and reckless, which means he is healthy. As soon as he becomes more collected, he is ill. In one word, as soon as the princess begins to behave differently, the symptoms of the disease return. Accepting the whole situation, the emperor decides that if this is so, then several servants will look after her. Before leaving, he also added that if something unusual happened, Ji-fan would be immediately summoned to the palace. Our hero even grinned a little that he had a wardmate, so to speak. Sometime later, when Ji-fan was already at his post, the prince came to him and asked how he was able to cure the disease. To which I received the answer, "Just give me a little more theory, and our hero will be better than any imperial doctor." Then, throwing his hand on his shoulder, the prince asked why he bought a piece of land from the Shunin estate. Ji-fan said that it was for business, but his face looked as if he was not telling something. The prince's eyes lit up with interest, and relying on his friendship with the main character, he asks to be initiated into this matter. Without thinking twice, Ji-fan asks if His Highness has money. The prince began to leave, saying that he had money and should not be considered some kind of poor man. Our hero asked where he was going. With a frightening face, he says that he is heading for a friendly conversation with his father, the emperor, and his mother, the queen. The next day, the emperor shouted loudly what was happening. The eunuch asked what happened. He looked at the old servant and asked where his favorite picture of 1,000 rivers and mountains had gone. At this time, the prince had already come to Ji-fan with some paper and the news that he had got money. The paper turned out to be an agreement which, judging by his face, incredibly surprised our hero. The emperor most likely guessed that his son was involved in the matter and sent a sentinel to follow him in order to find out what he was doing. The main thing is that no one finds out about it. The eunuch, in a panic, accepted the order and ran to carry out the assignment. The emperor was also perplexed by what was happening, mentally calling his son a dunce. Let's find out what the prince took. The first thing was a picture of 1,000 rivers and mountains, then a pair of ivory pen holders inlaid with gold. There are also several frescoes from the Tang dynasty. The emperor asked the servant to stop, as his head was already pounding from such news. At this time, the prince was telling Ji-fan how he sold all those things to fat man Wen Jinyuan. Who has forgotten, this is the trader to whom our hero sold all the ebony. Ji-fan was interested in the question of how Wen Jinyuan had the courage to buy the emperor's property. The prince replied that he really didn't want to take anything, but he didn't have the courage to refuse. After thinking a little, the main character came to the conclusion that the prince is a real tyrant, since he forces the poor merchant to buy things from him by force. Since Hao Zhao got the money, he is interested in whether they can now pull off the deal, and what their plan is. First of all, they will have to excavate the empty Xishan mountain, and for this they will need to hire people. In addition, the lands around Xishan still need to be redeemed, and our hero has already agreed with the owners. The prince didn't understand why they were digging, so he asked me to explain everything to him. He received an answer instantly. This is coal. Since it is cold now, Ji-fan decided to sell the coal from the mountain and make money from it. It is not surprising that the prince did not know why they needed that mountain, because before he had never heard that there was coal there. According to Ji-fan, people said that there is coal in the mountain, and now the weather is very cold. Without coal, people will freeze to death. Since this is an ideal opportunity to make money, the prince began to joyfully shout that they could become super rich. While it's cold, everyone will need coal. Coal in Sishan is located in a cavity, so it is easy and cheap to mine. Soon they will raise a lot of money. The prince even shed a tear. In his thoughts, he considered Zifan a true friend. Jifan himself had a slightly different opinion about the prince. He hoped to make him a scapegoat if the case failed. After our hero announced that he was buying land, landowners near Sishan began to come to him with the hope of making money. The protagonist's father, Feng Jinglong, also had several friends who were not against making money from such an opportunity. But he could no longer stand it, and said that he would cut off the hands of anyone who even once mentioned the earth or his son. At this time, news also reached the emperor that his son had spent all the money from selling things and started doing business with our hero. The fact that he had bought a bunch of wasteland also dawned on him. After the report, the servant asked whether the watchman should intervene. The emperor said loudly that of course he was, and also added that those two would not get away with all this. Both fathers, holding their heads, could not help but mention that their sons were demons. Let's return to our culprits. Jifan told the prince that the river would soon be completely covered with ice, which would complicate their work. And don't forget about the snow. The prince asked his sworn brother what he would do when they got rich. His plan will be to continue making money so that every person admires him. Hu Zhao said with a smile that as he thought, great minds think alike. Jifan mentioned that since they are opening a business, he needs a name, so he invites the prince to choose one. After thinking a little, the prince says that in his opinion the ideal name would be Zhengguo Coal Trade. Zhengguo is, if anything, a peaceful land. With a thumbs up, our hero says that it's not that bad. It just radiates imperialism. Asked a little dissatisfiedly what they were talking about, because he is an exceptionally competent and friendly person. Jifan said that he simply misspoke. Having decided on the name, our hero said that all that was left was to find a person who would handle sales. This requires a real professional. Both businessmen looked at each other and unanimously said that they knew the same person. A moment later, Wen Jinyuan had already been taken to the residence where the prince and our hero were located. One of the servants pushed the merchant inside. He said that it could have been easier. Jifan greeted him with a smile, saying that he was glad to see his brother Wen. He immediately folded his hands and began to cry and ask for mercy, because he would not be able to cope with such a burden. He began to say that only a couple of days ago, His Highness the Prince forced him to buy treasures from the imperial court for 200,000 liang of silver. But Jifan, saying that some 200,000 is not money, offered him one proposal. He said he wanted to work with him. The trader will be able to increase his trades, and they will both be in the black. The fat man began to roar even stronger, and thanked Zifan, asking what business he was going to offer him. With a calm face, our hero answered briefly and clearly that their product would be coal. And the very next moment, Wen Jinyuan hugged Jifan's knee and began to beg to let him go. According to him, it is impossible to sell coal. It constantly kills people due to thick smoke. His panic was incredible. Leaning towards the fat man, Jifan said that since they had been friends with him for a long time, he must honestly say that he did not want to cooperate with him. He raised his hand and directly said that he really did not want such cooperation. Smiling, our hero said that it was his right and he would not force him. No. But then came the question whether it was true that the prince had threatened him with such a huge sword. The fat man confirmed that everything was so. He brought with him a broadsword about 3 feet long, which he held at his head. Making a frightening expression on his face, our hero said that he understood everything. And his next action was to order his servant to bring him a blade with which he could hack to death a prince or an unscrupulous merchant. The fat man began to sweat and asked Zifan what it all meant, to which our hero, with a face no less terrifying than before, said Wen Jinyuan to relax, because this is not for him. The next moment, he was already angrily shouting that if Deng Zhang didn't hurry up and bring the blade, he would cut off his hands. This scream greatly frightened the merchant. Thanks to this incentive, the fat man had a desire to help Jifan with the sale of coal, because this is not such a bad idea. Our hero, grinning slightly, said that he himself proposed cooperation, and he did not force him. Next, consider the Imperial Palace. There is an office in its corner. Although it is not very visible, it is the center of all of China. The people working there, known as ministers, are the most literate citizens of the country. They are ruled by the emperor or the president, followed by the vice president, and so on. They are the authors of the most important memoirs for the throne. Their writing practically never stops. After writing, all memoirs are sent to the emperor for careful checking. Among everyone, they are the top 3 who have the status and power of the prime minister. It was they who helped Hongji achieve greatness and prosperity, a time known as the Silver Age of Hongji. If we talk about them in one word, they are the 3 big bosses. Let's now look at them one fine day when all 3 were sitting together discussing one issue, namely coal, by the way, the same one that our hero and the prince extract on Xishan. To the surprise of one of the old men, Liu Jian, This anthracite sent by His Highness is simply delicious. Although at first he was afraid that the prince decided to harm him, because coal is poisonous. But the old man still decided to set him on fire, since the prince could not hate his master. The second of the elders, Li Yangdong, noticed that this new coal had been burning for so long, but it did not smoke and did not make breathing difficult. In a word, a real miracle. The third, Zi Quan, said that such coal, which does not cause harm over such a long burning time, will be very convenient for heating. Liu Jiang added that he had heard about the availability of this coal. For the common people, it will be a blessing, and no one else will suffer from the winter cold. A few words were also heard from Li Yangdong, namely that the prince was guided in his affairs by Feng Jifan. True, it is unknown how significant his influence is. Our hero could not even think that the three bosses would notice him. Fast forward to our businessmen. The prince was telling us that after the feast the emperor would be giving a speech to the whole family, so he would have to go. He also wanted to see our hero there, so he has to go there. But Jifan understood that when His Majesty summons you along with the prince, it is not good. But he had no choice as such, because the emperor could not be refused. Already in the imperial palace, His Majesty loudly called out our hero by name. He had something to say. When he read his essay for the provincial examination, the emperor found it quite useful, but now he had doubts about its practicality. Jifan was not surprised that the emperor began to ask his advice on various matters, and His Majesty at that moment thought that since our hero began to do something with the prince, he urgently needed to find a reason to besiege him. The emperor directly says that in his opinion, the plan with the provincial exam would be impractical. Jifan bowed and politely asked that His Majesty explain to him what exactly he considered the problem. The answer was not long in coming. The emperor said that although the plan seemed incredibly effective, it was very difficult to implement. It will work like a powerful medicine, changing the local lands and returning them to their former greatness. But the problem is that this will lead to discontent among the rulers of different regions, which will only make the situation worse. The emperor's response was literally a topic mentioned not long ago. After listening to everything that was said, our hero began to think that His Majesty's fears were absolutely justified. Jifan's recollections: there should soon be an uprising in Guizhou and Guangxi. They will happen this year. So he decides to stand his ground, saying that if the problem that is causing these uprisings is not solved with his plan, things will get much worse. This is especially true for Guizhou and Guangxi. Our hero also confidently says that a new uprising will soon arise, which will develop into a revolution. The advisors standing nearby began to be indignant, saying that with his words, our hero had insulted the official Quan. Quan Yue served the emperor as viceroy of Shandong and Henan, keeping his career pure. He is very educated and is an example for all scientists in the nation. The emperor understood that everything was going in the wrong direction. He just wanted to put pressure on Jifan, but he only became inspired. And at that time, Jifan himself remembered who the official Quan was. History records him as the city's rich man, whom the rebels would hang and beat to death. But he couldn't say this, so he began to praise him, adding at the end that he was too diligent, and with his methods it would be difficult to govern the provinces in the southwest. His Majesty had already begun to regret that he had provoked our all-knowing hero, so with the words that it was slander towards the great official, he proposed to finish. The advisors looked menacingly at Zifanya, said that he had no right to say whatever he wanted so arrogantly. The next victim of the emperor was the poor prince, who had no idea what awaited him. A simple smile on his face, he approached his father and said that he was listening attentively. His Majesty calmly asked him to tell him what he read the other day. So the guy suffered a sad fate. He didn't know what to say in his own defense, and he didn't have much clothes on. The emperor looked closely at the prince and asked if he had read anything at all. Full of tension, Hu Jiao says that he recently taught spring and autumn. Most likely this is some kind of poem. The emperor said loudly that he should begin to tell the story clearly and with expression. While a drop of sweat ran down his temple, he began to recite the first lines. So far there was no hesitation in his speech, but after a few sentences his knowledge of the text ended. The poor guy was all tense, not knowing whether he could survive until tomorrow. The emperor, looking at his son with an incredibly angry look, asks if he can tell him anything else, or this is the end. The prince had nothing to say, so he simply stood silently, wondering what would happen to him in the next moment. His Majesty began to shout loudly, asking his beloved son what he had been doing all the past days. Under even greater pressure, he could barely say that he was studying. Apparently, he hoped that this would save him. At this moment, Yan Qin's assistant, Wang Hua, decides to speak. Like Saj Yan, he is responsible for the prince's education. He has something to say to His Majesty. Having received permission, he began to say that he had information about His Highness the Prince. There is also evidence to support this information. He did business with a Gonzi Phanim. Gonzi is like a prince. The other advisors were shocked that the prince was pursuing a commoner's profession. Also, some thought that Ji Fan was pushing him around, which is even more terrible. The Hongzhi Emperor also did not know how to react to such news, so he closed his eyes and tried to collect his thoughts. The assistant added that this was not all. They also sold coal and stated that it could be used to heat homes. At this point, everyone could no longer contain their surprise and simply opened their mouths in incredible shock. The advisors began to discuss the correctness of everything they had heard, and indeed their enterprise was simply selling coal. Someone mentioned that charcoal is generally inconvenient to use and poisonous. Yes, and it does not warm well, as charcoal can help with this. At this point, the prince loudly announced with a grin that he was selling not just coal but anthracite. One of those standing in the crowd thought that the prince might have gone completely crazy. Ji Fan joins the conversation, saying that in fact, he and His Highness the Prince are not engaged in entrepreneurship at all. Our hero began to praise Hu Zhao, saying that they were actually working for the well-being of the common people. The prince is very concerned about the people of his country, so he decided to contribute to their well-being. The emperor interrupted them by shouting like a dragon. He promised to give both such a spanking that they would not even be able to sit. Both of our businessmen expected a slightly different reaction, so at first they tried to comprehend everything that was happening. His Majesty, without lowering his tone, continued to shout that they most likely did not even understand what crime they had committed. But the educational process was interrupted by the intervention of the cabinet manager, Liu Jian, who turned to the emperor. Everyone was surprised by the appearance of such an important person. The minor advisors like those standing there began to discuss that if his lordship Liu challenged Feng Jifan's opinion, it would be bad luck for both of them. The emperor heard him and asked what he wanted to say. Liu Jian interrupted him. He folded his hands and made a slight bow and said that he considered the anthracite delivered by the young gentleman very useful. Everyone present in the hall not only opened their mouths in surprise, but also their hats jumped up. Everyone was shocked by Liu Jian's words. The emperor was also no exception. With his mouth slightly open, he quietly and hesitantly asked that Manager Liu repeat what had been said earlier. All the subjects were in complete shock. They looked at what was happening with their mouths open and did not understand why this was so. All the subjects around did not understand what this meant, and therefore they opened their mouths wide in surprise. One of the men said that this was unthinkable and that this could not happen at all. He was in shock. Official Liu was on the side of the prince and our hero Feng Jifanya. Everyone was shocked by this. Feng Jifan with young Prince Chenaram stood and did not move. People around asked what was going on there. The man grabbed his head and said that it simply couldn't get worse. One of the men stood up and addressed his emperor as His Majesty. The man stood in front of the emperor and said that he also agreed and that this anthracite was magnificent. Everyone was even more shocked and said that things were getting even crazier because official show was with them. Another man stood in front of the emperor and addressed him. He said that these two had done something of incredible importance, and many problems had been solved thanks to this anthracite. The man also added that the great feat of these young men provided people with a further quiet life, and he really appreciates this. One of the officials closed his mouth and cried. He said, Official Li was also with them. He did not understand where the world was heading. The two young men bumped fists and laughed quietly. They were glad that everything worked out. Our hero smiled and looked at the prince, pointing at himself with his finger. He could barely contain his laughter. The young Prince Chen pointed his finger at our hero and smiled back. The emperor was in complete shock. He thought that all three were members of his cabinet, and by an incredible coincidence, all three were mistaken and decided to praise this coal. It was impossible. The emperor turned to one of the officials, namely the official Liu, and asked what he meant. The man folded his hands and turned to the emperor. He began to explain. The man said that not only the capital, but also from Beijing to Tongzhou, even the provinces of Henan and Shandong, they were all completely covered with snow. The man continued, saying that the coal continues to grow, and the commoners do not have enough firewood, and there is no number of people who have died from the cold. The man said that the emperor was very honest and kind-hearted. He asked if he had seen that people were freezing and starving without hope of salvation. The man said that even the most savvy wife could not feed the family without rice. But today, His Highness the Prince and Feng Jifan really came up with a brilliant idea with this coal. The man said that he was a seasoned veteran in this business, compared soft coal with charcoal, and new coal turned out to be durable, odorless, smokeless, and safe. The man also added that he found out that this coal costs 10 times less than charcoal. Coal is available to the common population and people can easily warm themselves, the man concluded. He said that thanks to this anthracite, the number of frost victims will decrease many times over. The emperor was in complete shock and was surprised that this coal could replace charcoal. The guy put his fist to his heart and said that he guarantees this to the emperor. His Majesty the Emperor clenched his teeth and fell silent. He had nothing to say, because everything that was said earlier was too convincing. The emperor shed a tear and exhaled. He said that their glorious ancestors really blessed them. Our hero was dissatisfied. He apologized and said that it was all thanks to him, and why the emperor changed his shoes so abruptly, and attributed his merits to his ancestors. The emperor looked at our hero and said that in this case, he could not even imagine how many lives could be saved and turned to Feng Zifan and the prince. He asked how much coal could be mined in a day. The prince, smiling, said that as long as there were enough workers, any number would not be a problem. The guy said that he plans to hire more labor, and is also thinking about employing refugees from the capital and beyond. All of them suffer from cold and hunger. They also continued the story that His Highness took pity on the refugees, and decided to hire as many as possible to help with the excavations. The emperor looked at the prince and smiled. After a short pause, the joyful emperor smiled even stronger and said that finally his son had done at least something worthwhile. In the end, Anthracite made a good impression. The emperor wanted to say something to the prince and Ji-fan, and then only the two of them and the emperor himself remained in the palace. The joyful prince turned to his father, pointing at himself with his finger. He said that everyone was like him, he was capable of much. The man looked very seriously and menacingly at his son, and asked about 1,000 rivers and mountains. The guy fell silent and displeasedly turned his head in the other direction so as not to see the emperor's gaze. The emperor asked if he had really robbed him, and it was true. And then he paused for a moment. After a pause, the emperor looked at our hero and said that 7 feng divides the profits in half, but from now on the prince is not involved in the business. The emperor also added that our hero can send half of the prince to the imperial treasury. The prince was shocked and said that he was now a dead man. By the time the emperor approved the sale of anthracite, Feng Jifan has already calculated everything in advance. The guy smiled and realized that he could become a prophet in less than a year. He was glad about it. Of course, any monopoly owned by an ordinary citizen will definitely bring huge profits with little investment. Zhengguo's coal trade will definitely be successful. The reason for this was the label with the name of the prince. Now it is with the name of the emperor, and it will attract even more attention. This plan was brilliant. The two men were discussing that Prince Zhu was now Hao Zhao is busy and working like hell. Up until this point, the Zhan brothers from the Shuning and Jianchang estates did not know that the land they sold to Ji-fan was so valuable. One clear day, 2 men walked behind our hero and then called him Nephew Feng and asked where he was going. Feng Jifan turned his head and wondered if these were the pair of rotten eggs that Xishan sold him. One of the men laughed and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and his nephew was losing weight, and then they invited him to stay with them. The guy understood that they were definitely relatives of the Empress and thought that he wouldn't mind trying a bird's nest. The man said that birds' nests are not that good, but drinking water is very good. Afterwards, the man and his brother pointed their finger at Feng Zifan and said that they had not forgotten the essence, and also added that our hero began selling coal. Our hero smiled and said that this is so, and also added that this is a small business to earn a pretty penny. The man thought that our hero was a fool, and since he had money, why didn't he pay his brothers as much as was required? The men smiled and, looking at our hero, unanimously wished him good luck. The men looked at the young man, thought that he was a complete idiot, and also smiled. Feng Jifan looked at the two of them and smiled, thinking that they were 2 complete idiots. Meanwhile, a carriage was approaching our hero and his 2 interlocutors. It was a large carriage with a lot of snow on the roof. Feng Jifan and the men looked at this carriage. When the man got out of the carriage, the 2 men who spoke with our hero were very much amazed and shocked. Our hero looked at him and said nothing. It was impossible to read on his face what he was thinking about. Coming out of the carriage, the man turned to Feng Jifanyu, asked if he was the young gentleman from the Nanhe estate. The man introduced himself as Den Ton from the Four Seas Trading Company. He said he would like to discuss with Gonzi Fanem is one thing. The man was wearing a green, warm robe. The 2 brothers were shocked as much as possible. They fell into a stupor and opened their mouths wide in surprise when they heard that the person was from the Four Seas Trading Company. The Four Seas Trading Company, the main group of entrepreneurs in Beijing, is known throughout the world. They trade in everything from furs to silk. They have branches not only in the capital, but also in Nanjing, Suzhou, Hangzhou, and other famous places. They even own a personal bank. As for Denton, he is only a public face, and if he is capable of running a big business, then the people behind him must be incredible entrepreneurs. There are rumors that the company may be linked to Wei Guogan, garrisoned in Nanjing, as well as Gengfu in the capital. The 2 men couldn't believe it. One of them said that the Four Seas Trading Company was looking for Feng Ford Zifan to start doing business with him. It seemed impossible to him. Our hero, with a pathetic face, turned to Denton and asked what the matter was. He wanted to discuss it with him. Dentong said that the Four Seas Trading Company wants to buy the Xishan lands from him. One of the men picked his ear and asked if he heard it. He was surprised that a trading company wanted to buy this vacant lot. Deng Tong said that they have investigated and know that Feng Jifan owns half of Shishan, and also added that this is not a problem, because this is the half they need. The man also added that they were ready to pay 1,000,000 liang for this land, and asked our hero what he thought about it. The men were completely shocked by such prices for this, in their words, wasteland. Then, Dentong offered as much as 5 million for Feng's share of land Zifanya. The man was in complete shock that Denton from the Four Seas Company offered him as much as 5 million for the land. Then the men came to the girl and called her sister. They said that the sister should help them, because this treasure belongs to them. The first man cried and said that this scoundrel, the offender Feng Jifan, took advantage of the opportunity and robbed them. The second in turn cried and said that the guy had deceived them both and bought this land for only 80,000 liang, and it was the result of their hard work. The girl listened to them silently, and the men continued to say that this was an insult not only to the Jiang family, but also to her. The second added that it's okay if he doesn't care about them. But his sister... The man banged his head against the wall and, turning to his sister, shouted that he did not want to live like this. Finally, the girl put on a serious face and asked both of them to stop. Apparently, she was tired of listening to the whining from her brothers. The brothers fell silent after the girl's words. They looked at her with surprise and open mouths. There was an awkward pause. After a short pause, one of the men, turning to his sister, asked, "Why doesn't she ask His Majesty to issue a decree?" The sister remained silent. Instead of answering her brother, the girl slapped her brother in the face with all her might. The man almost cried. He held his cheek on which the blow was made and asked his sister why she hit him. The girl, putting on a serious face, began to shout that the men themselves sold this land, after which they were also happy, and now they are telling her this. She said this place was bought by Hao Zhao and Ji Fan. She also added that the purchase was honest, and now the brothers are proving to her that her son took their lands by force. The men had nothing to say, so they simply looked at her in silence. The angry girl screamed for the brothers to immediately leave this building and asked them to stop disgracing themselves in front of everyone. When leaving, the men roared bitterly, because almost no one could make such a mistake, and they lost a lot of money due to their stupidity. One fine, clear winter day. The weather was good outside and the sun was trying to warm the earth a little. Someone was walking down the street and said that he was in a hurry to show someone something. Feng Jifan saw his students and asked what they forgot in this place. The guys unanimously said that the students were greeting their patron, and also bowed to him with folded hands. The guy looked at the students and asked if they really wanted to study more because they had arrived at this place. With a horrifying look, the students refused and said that they did not really want to study. Our hero's father looked at our hero and the prince and said that he had a great idea. He continued, saying that the day before yesterday the prince's father checked their account and saw that most of the money had been spent. The man laughed and asked if our hero had really spent all the money he earned from selling ebony. Our hero looked at his father and did not really understand what was happening now. The father said that it was all his fault and he had failed in training Jifan in the past, and therefore he should become an example for his son. The man, pointing to the students, said that his father and 3 students came to this conclusion after reading the book. The man asked the students to talk about indoctrination. It is a method of enlightenment through education and personal experience. Realizing that everything was not going well, disciple Ouyang did not readily agree with the guy's father and said that the master of the master was right. Putting his hand on his heart, the man laughed and said that from now on he would teach his son to be thrifty. Our hero made a serious look, looked into his father's eyes and asked if he really decided to ask for help for this. Barely holding back his laughter, the prince pointed his finger at the students and thought that these 3 were his students, and they decided to teach the teacher's father how to raise their teacher. Realizing that everything was really bad and the situation was heating up, Student Ouyang cried and asked that they just be punished, and that's all. Our hero's father cleared his throat and said that training would be by example, giving verbal instructions. He also added that the guy should be hardworking and thrifty. Extending his hand, the man asked his son to let him explain how to become like this and told his son to look at him. On the floor there was a small cauldron in which Feng's soft coal was burning Zifanya. Our hero looked displeased at this soft coal and said that it was anthracite. The guy didn't want to linger. The man laughed and said that his son is already well aware. He also added that the coal had arrived 2 days earlier and said that it was very hot. The man shouted that the fact was that anthracite was very cheap. Very, very cheap. Much better than that nasty charcoal. Our hero looked at his father in surprise and did not understand anything. He did not understand why his father was telling him all this now. The father waved his finger and said that this is what he wants to convey to his son. They should spend money on really necessary things and should not spend money that they don't need to spend. He also added that there is no need to spend money on things like that wasteland that the guy bought before, and people are now laughing at them. The man asked if his son understood. Feng Zifan stood in the same surprised pose and answered his father that he did not understand anything. The father grabbed his mustache and said that he did not understand what his son did not understand, and also laughed. Our hero said that anthracite is mined in Shishan. He has a lot of it, but his father still spends money on it, and also asked if his father is all right in his head. The father looked at his son in surprise and was shocked that soft coal was mined in Sishan. And then he was even more surprised when he remembered that Sishan was in the domain of their family, which means there was a short pause, and then there was laughter. The man shouted that they were rich. The joyful father hugged his son and asked him to be closer, because now daddy would kiss him. The guy shouted that it would be better if they killed him. The next day, the weather is nice and clear. There are not many clouds in the sky, and the sun is trying to illuminate everything through them. Huge building. Our hero was addressed as Brother Fan and said that he was accused there. Sighing heavily, our hero asked who didn't like something this time. It was plainly written on his face that this was injustice. Smiling, the prince said that the imperial censor accused our hero of insulting the ministers and even recorded all his misdeeds. The news of this has already spread all over and caused a commotion. Feng Jifan smiled and said that this was just slander and also invited His Highness to play chess or ride horses. What high-ranking person was not captured by the imperial censor? Even the emperor himself was scolded by him for refusing a concubine. The guy continued to think, saying that according to the censor, the life of the emperor is too decent, which is why there are practically no sons. Our hero believed that this was only a joy for him, and from a metropolitan hooligan he turned into a celebrity. Our hero put on cool black glasses and made a pretentious face. He understood that this was all a sign of growth. Liu Jin said, turning to Feng Zhongchu seems to know what's going on. Our hero turned around and said that this bastard is Liu and he knows what a sycophant he is. The guy said that the thing is that Feng Zhongchu insulted Quan Yue, governor of Guizhou. Since many people at court were on good terms with him, such rudeness aroused their anger. Our hero made a strange face and sighed and said, "What is it?" He understood everything. The prince put on a serious face and said that he is always ready, and he and Brother Fan will decide this today. They will ambush him at the house of the imperial censor and beat him, putting a bag on his head. Our hero, looking at the smiling prince, thought that this idiot didn't care about anything, and he just wanted to have fun. Our hero said that fortunately the imperial censors are ordinary scribblers under the emperor, and they have the right to catch the wind and chase the shadow. Our hero said that beating each of them was a strange thing for His Majesty to do. The guy said that jokes should be put aside and said that he and the prince are rich now. The prince made a dissatisfied face and said that he no longer had money, and also added that his father had taken it. Feng Jifan made an awkward face and said that in any case it is better for them to fight with words than with actions, because gentlemen only use words. The prince clenched his fist and said that there was no use from these words, and also added that talking could not do any harm, and disagreeing with our hero, said that fists work much better. Our hero raised his finger up and, embarrassed, thought that this was simply wonderful. Meanwhile in Guizhou, the weather was bad, and therefore strong waves crashed against the rocks. The strong wind almost uprooted the grass. It swayed very violently back and forth. Blood spilled onto the grass and flowers, which were swaying from the strong wind. What was going on there? The man, looking very menacing, struck the soldier's chest with his sword and crossed his entire body diagonally. The other soldiers who were watching this became suddenly alarmed and looked at the man with anger. A crowd of soldiers ran towards the man, holding their swords in their hands, to take revenge on him for their fallen comrade. However, some archer took aim. Pulling the bowstring, the archer was completely ready to shoot at that very second. A whole squad of archers who were camouflaged began to fire, and a hail of arrows flew from the place from where they were shooting. The soldiers looked into the sky and were very stunned. They saw something they did not expect to see at all. A whole rain of arrows was coming straight into this crowd of night soldiers who were running towards that man. All the soldiers screamed loudly in one voice. Every arrow wounded someone. It was a defeat. Through time, from some tent, which was guarded by 2 soldiers, terrible screams were heard. The guy without an arm screamed at the top of his voice in pain. Losing an arm is very difficult for a soldier. Leaving the tent, Quan Yue said that right now it just doesn't make any sense. The man thought that Mi Lu, the daughter of the leader, she married Long Chung, but they could not get along, which is why they turned against each other. Mi Lu gathered soldiers from her native lands and invaded the Puan estate in Guizhou, killed her husband, proclaimed herself the great king of heaven, and staged a real rebellion. The man had cold sweat dripping from his face. He realized that now things were going very, very badly. Clenching his fist, the man said that he could not understand the local people at all. The man understood that when things go this way, all that remains is to stop this uprising. The emperor, reading some documents, smiled and said that this was very interesting. The man asked whether official Zhu himself had read this petition, and looked at the man who was standing next to him. Official Zhu smiled and said that of course he had read it. He said that Lord Shuning and Jiang Chang jointly signed this impeachment petition, and of course it was directed towards Feng Zifanya. The man continued, saying that they wrote about every misdeed our hero committed. Zhu himself thought about this. Official Zhu said that of course Lord Shuning and Jiang Cheng have always been stupid. They blamed Jia Fan because of personal differences. The old man continued, saying that it was still not worth publishing this petition and wanted to add something, but he did not remain silent for long. The rest of the officials watched the dialogue between the emperor and the official Zhu, and pretended that they were not really listening. Official Zhu said that Quan's political successes Yue cannot be overlooked. He has a noble pedigree and has a great reputation among scholars. But he was slandered by Ji Fan. The man also added that His Majesty could use this as a reason to rein in the boy. The emperor said that this was well said, and he should deal with it immediately. After a while, still the same huge building with a huge blue balcony. What was happening inside? The prince came inside, greeted the emperor and folded his hands, bowing to him. The emperor said that there was no need for pleasantries, and then he turned to our hero as an official and asked how things were going with him. Our hero bowed and said that the lowest Feng Jifan greets the emperor. The guy began to idolize the emperor and shower him with lovely words non-stop. The emperor made a dissatisfied face and silently looked at our Feng Zifanya, as if he had done something very wrong. One of the officials said that this is very strong and shameless flattery. He was a little surprised. The emperor said that he summoned the young man because he had received several papers about his impeachment, and this petition was sent to him by Zhang Feng, imperial censor. Our hero was awkwardly embarrassed and realized that this was once again another impeachment. The emperor continued that a large petition was coming from the Lord Shuning and Jiang Cheng. They accused our hero of insulting the minister and inappropriate behavior. In his head, our hero laughed very loudly and was surprised at such a thick stack of papers, and then jokingly thought that it would be better to write a book about him. Looking at the young man with a menacing gaze, the emperor asked what Feng Zifan can say in his own defense. Our hero made a thoughtful face and asked His Majesty when he managed to insult the minister. The emperor told the guy not to act like a fool and said that he had slandered the right hand of the imperial censor and lord of Guangzhou, Quan Yue. Our hero clasped his hands and said that he was simply expressing his opinion based on the facts, and also asked why this was considered an insult, and added that it was unfair. The emperor shouted that even now the guy denied his guilt, and also asked if Feng his everyday rudeness and lawlessness were not enough for Zifan. The emperor frowned and said even more firmly that with so many petitions against him, he could answer the people, and this time he would have to punish the young man. In his head, the emperor supported himself and said that he needed to scare the boy so much that he would be afraid to take another step. Our Feng Jifan was a little confused and didn't know what to say to him. He wanted to come up with an excuse, but he couldn't. Someone entered the hall and all the attention was on our Feng Zifan moved to the man who entered the hall. Our hero looked at the newcomer in great surprise. The person who entered said that he was a student at Jiangxi Imperial University and had an urgent report to the emperor, a very important one. The student said that he urgently needed an audience with His Majesty. The emperor told the student to come in and speak out. A guy came in and said that the governor of Guangzhou was reporting an emergency. Our hero stood nearby and looked in surprise. The emperor asked what happened, to which the guy said that Milu, the daughter of a local chieftain from the Jiangyi estate in Yunnan, had declared a rebellion due to bad relations between her and her husband. He also added that when the manager found out about this, he immediately began to resist, and unfortunately, there was a slight pause. The guy said that they were defeated. The emperor was as shocked as possible by such news. He opened his mouth in surprise, and his eyes were huge and wide. The leaders have great power and are prone to rebellion. If you want to keep them in line, you will have to keep a close eye on them and control them with the help of troops, as if putting them in a corner. Quan Yue nevertheless decided to hold peace negotiations and sat down at the same table with the other side of the conflict. Now that the attempt to suppress the uprising has failed, the reputation of the imperial court in the Yunnan and Guizhou regions is in great danger. The emperor hit the table with his fist and shouted that Quan Yue failed him. He was unhappy about it. The emperor sat with a dissatisfied face and did not understand how this happened. Everything was sad. One of the subjects fell to his knees, and turning to His Majesty said that it was his fault, because he recommended Quan Yue. One of the officials said that this is not the time to repent and beg for punishment. Reinforcements must be sent immediately, and the uprising must be suppressed. This cannot be left to chance. The emperor stood up, took a couple of steps and stopped. He frowned, and then thought about something. Comparing all the facts, the man was shocked that Feng Jifan spoke about the possibility of an uprising of the leaders, and it happened. Another guy thought that Quan Yue is too diligent to rule in Guizhou, and was right again. All this alerted the emperor. He looked with a frightened look and said that this young man's quick-wittedness frightened him. Making a mysterious face, the emperor said that as a result, Geitu Guilu was the only right decision. The man said that their primary task at the moment is to suppress the uprising. By decree, The emperor calls on the Minister of Revenue, Wang Shu of Nanjing, also the second assistant imperial censor, to assume the position of governor of Guizhou and suppress the uprising. The man cleared his throat and also added in the decree that in order to suppress the uprising, the army would have to be mobilized. The emperor said that after this, he would immediately use Gaitaguilu, but first, it was necessary to defeat the rebellion troops. The emperor said that he would forcefully replace the leaders with low-ranking officials to keep them from trying to strengthen their influence, and then educate the local population. The man also added that after this, he would be given land and the right to engage in peaceful labor. The emperor asked our hero's opinion on this topic. Our hero made a serious, menacing face and said with complete confidence that this was too little. The prince, who stood next to our hero, was shocked after the words of his brother. The guy did not understand anything. The emperor didn't understand Feng Jifanya. He said that wasn't the Gitu Guilu, the decision of our hero, and also asked what did not suit him now. Our hero looked at the emperor, smiled, and then laughed maliciously. Feng Jifan said that if you laugh, you can make people laugh, and added that they must make their move at a certain moment if they want to win in the long run. The guy added, because there are still problems with trust. The officials who listened were a little shocked, and our hero said that for hundreds and thousands of years, the inhabitants of these lands trusted the leaders. Having received power by inheritance, they are revered as higher beings. Is the emperor confident that by offering them benefits, they will listen to the imperial court, and therefore they need to win their trust? Listening to all this very carefully, the emperor looked at our hero and said that this was quite reasonable. Our hero continued that after the uprising is suppressed, inform the residents that the soldiers and officers are ready to leave them alone, and the emperor will generously distribute the remaining audit. Each of them will receive 20 jin of grain and a piece of salt. When the residents return, the soldiers should not interfere, no matter how many people come and how much food is distributed. The guy continued that then, in a few months, the emperor should order the distribution of provisions again in order to gain even more trust from the locals. From this moment on, the leaders will think that the army has retreated and there is no longer a threat, and the population will be well fed and grateful to their patrons. After this, there should be no problem with their plan. The guy continued, explaining that the emperor would show them that he understood the hardships of the life of an ordinary worker and prepare the transfer of a large amount of fertile lands to the leaders. And in gratitude for the favor of the leaders, the emperor will call them nobility and give them a position in the government. This will allow them to be taken away from their native lands. Our hero continued, saying that in this way, the confrontation between the leaders and the new rulers would not make sense for the locals. He wondered why they should risk supporting rebellions when they could enjoy the benefits of imperial greatness. The emperor listened carefully to our hero. Feng Jifan said that His Majesty, this is the only way for long-term peace and stability. This way he can cut the Gaida from the shoulder gale like an axe and success will await him. To Feng, as attentively as the Emperor Jifanya, said that this guy's clear mind terrifies him. The prince thought for a moment and said that, as expected, his brother Fan had a first-class plan. And then he laughed and said what a show-off he was. A whole crowd of court officials stood in front of the emperor. He stood up and addressed them all. He asked what they thought about official Feng's plan. Zifan made a menacing face. The officials began to hold onto their beards and quietly speculate out loud about this plan. Our hero thought that in the end, this is an important matter of state, and no matter how capable, ministers must carefully consider their decision. The prince shouted at the top of his voice that in his opinion this was the best plan. The emperor was shocked by what he heard. The emperor watched his son and did not understand anything. The young prince turned to His Royal Highness. The guy was serious. He stood in front of His Majesty and wanted to say something. Feng Jifan made a questioning expression on his face and wondered what the prince was up to. The emperor thought about the fact that he had originally planned to punish Feng Jifan, but his idea turned out to be extremely promising. It delighted him so much that he has no desire to punish him. The man continued to think that the sticks had already been brought up, and stopping them without a good reason would not be clever, and therefore he wanted to take advantage of his son. The man opened his eyes. The young prince said that in his opinion, the locals, like their common people, want to eat their fill and stay warm. Such a gift will be a sign of incredible generosity for them. The guy continued, saying that as long as they could satisfy these needs, people would definitely be drawn to the imperial court. One of the court officials was very surprised that it turned out that their spoiled prince was not indifferent to the people. The emperor was shocked by the words of his son. He did not understand whether he was serious and could not believe his ears at all. The emperor smiled, pointed his finger at his son, laughed, and asked if he was now speaking at someone's direction. There were two people standing in front of him, a serious-minded prince and our Feng Jifan, who was in his shadow. The guy made an awkward face and said that this was not true at all, and that he was saying this of his own free will. The youth said that when he visited the coal mines in Shishan, he saw scantily clad miners. Watching this, the young prince realized all the hardships of the daily life of ordinary people without status and money. The guy continued that for them, this work is the only key to survival. He recalled how he asked our hero why the workers bow, to which he learned that they provided them with work. The prince said that he had been thinking about this for the past few days, and it turns out that people need extremely ordinary things. Emperors of all dynasties denied their people their needs, which is why uprisings arose from everywhere, followed by wars until inevitable defeat. The guy made an angry and at the same time upset face. He beat himself on the chest and said that his heart was breaking from this. The emperor was completely shocked by what he saw. He did not expect this from his stupid son, the prince. The court officials, listening as carefully to the young prince as the emperor, were shocked by the words of the young guy. At this time, Feng Jifan got a little angry and thought that the fact that the prince was on Shishan should have remained a secret. The father asked his son to continue. The guy said that in his heart he despises the emperors who left their people to their fate, closing their doors to them. The guy added that they left wine rivers and meat banks for themselves. They did not care about the death of the inhabitants of their country, and their death is solely their fault. The guy bowed and concluded by saying that he therefore believed that if they followed Feng's plan to Zifan, then absolute success awaits them, and he guarantees this to the emperor. The emperor was shocked by the deep thought of his foolish son, and therefore he opened his mouth in surprise and froze. The officials, one after another, watched the conversation between the emperor and the young prince. They did not take their eyes off them. Someone held his beard, thinking over every word that the participants in the dialogue said, and someone straightened his mustache. The emperor shed a tear and was happy, thinking about the fact that his son had finally matured and what kind of an adult he had become. And after that, I thought that the main thing was not to overdo it. Otherwise, success would turn the young prince's head. Not knowing what to get to the bottom of, the emperor cleared his throat and asked if the prince had really been to the Sishan mines. After these words, the young man seemed to have an epiphany. From the outside, it seemed as if he had been shot. He was a little shocked. The guy covered our Feng with his hand. Jifan said that it was only his initiative, and it was definitely not Brother Feng who took him there. Our hero was of course very surprised by such actions from the prince. Smiling, our hero called the young prince an asshole, but since no one was scolded, then everything suited him. The emperor removed his menacing face and told his son not to do that again, and then looked at our hero. He looked at our hero carefully and then turned and said, "What about Zifan?" Our hero made an amazing face, bowed, and said that he was ready to listen to His Majesty. The emperor said that after what happened to Quan Yue, he regrets that he did not listen to our hero earlier, and therefore, he said that therefore the guy will remain at the university and will do his best to continue the education of the young prince. Feng Jifan understood that accompanying the prince to training was an obvious badge of honor. He probably also tried to build a relationship with him to create his own circle of associates. However, the guy understood that in the Ming dynasty there were no escort officials, and he did not know how to evaluate the current situation. Feng Jifan made a strange smile and politely asked His Majesty to explain who exactly he was talking about from the retinue. One of the courtiers was extremely shocked when he heard such a question, and wondered how the guy could even turn his tongue to ask about such a thing. Another court official believed that Feng Jifan is a fool and has lost his sense of tact, as if a person were awarded a beautiful painting, and later he would be curious about how much it costs. The emperor made a strange, incomprehensible face and fell silent. He was silent for several minutes. After silence, the man turned his head and told everyone to go about their business. Our hero, together with the young prince, bowed and said that they were already leaving, and when they turned away from the emperor, they thought about how to quickly leave this place. Our hero said that Liu, at the top of all priorities now, is the suppression of unrest. Meanwhile, the emperor stood in front of the officials and said that the end of the year was now approaching, and invited the man to come next year. Then the springtime for exams would come. Our hero smiled and realized that checking the time of the 12th year of Hong's reign Z is almost there. Our hero said that he really hopes that 3 of his students will successfully complete it, and then he will be able to fully enjoy the fruits of his labors. Our hero smiled and said that he couldn't wait to see the final. And by the way, it was during this period that the testing turned out to be the most unpredictable. The guy continued that the surrender would be unpredictable, because there would be a scandal involving one scientist from Jiangnian. Our hero even still remembered his poem. In the village of Peach Blossoms, there is a cozy hut in which lived a nice little fairy. She planted peach trees for fun. Laughing, the guy said that, thanks to the modern actor who starred in the film, one phrase suggests itself at the end. Oh my god, I love stewed chicken wings. Unlike his ridiculous image on television, in reality, 28-year-old Tang Ying's daily routine is very hard and miserable. And still, there are differences between the recognized best, because a person who entered a local school in a remote place is completely different compared to the star of a high school in a huge metropolis. Our hero believed that the boy was already heading to the capital. Having reached Beijing, he would get involved in a scandal because of his own fellow candidates, with whom he grew up in the same city. Our hero continued, saying that for this, the guy would be thrown into prison, where he would be subjected to severe torture. Soon, the imperial court will issue a verdict banning him from ascending to any government position, and thus, the talented and inspired Jie Yuantang will have to live a poor life. However, our hero stopped and thought. He thought about it in his head for a long time and decided that he will probably be able to save the young man, because he does not believe that such an intelligent person could cheat. The only logical explanation for such a tragic scenario is getting closer to bad people. Our hero thought that his brother should not worry, and he is under his protection. We just need to stop the scoundrel's attempts to make contact with him upon his arrival in the capital. Feng Jifan believed that now his followers were working hard tirelessly. He even managed to introduce them with additional questions for their homework. He wanted the students to be smarter. The guy understood that his students were not as gifted as Tang Yin, so the birds would have to try their first flight. At this time, the prince leaned on our hero and began to laugh loudly. He asked what Ji was thinking about Pan, and then said that he hoped that he did not make a mistake and said everything correctly. Our hero smiled and showed a thumbs up to the young prince and said that he had not made a mistake and had made a great speech. The prince said that he was still scared at the sight of his father. Our hero said that he was too. And then the prince smiled and asked again. They began a dialogue on this topic. At that moment, while the guys were discussing something, a servant ran up to them and addressed His Highness the Prince and Master Fan. The guys turned to him. The servant said that the princess wanted to meet at Kunning Palace because she had heard about the visit of both of them, and also asked Mr. Fan to visit her ladyship again later. Our hero made a frightened and surprised face, and then thought about it and said that for sure, he had completely forgotten about something. Meanwhile, it was winter, there was a snowstorm outside, the weather was far from the best. Kunning Palace. The young prince with our hero Feng Zifanem entered the empress's chambers. The prince ran in and started screaming like a savage mommy. Our hero looked at him in surprise. The girl sat in her throne and was glad that our hero and the prince had finally arrived to her. The prince ran to hug his mother because he missed her terribly, and they had not seen each other for a long time. The woman looked at our hero and told him that she welcomed him. The young prince was a little upset because he wasn't given enough attention. Our hero ran up to the empress and greeted her, calling her auntie. He said that the woman looked beautiful, just like a written beauty, and he almost thought that it was a princess sitting there. The girl smiled, covered her mouth, and giggled a little. She said that our hero flatters her. After this, our hero saw someone or something, and then he was very surprised and thought about it. Standing in front of him were two brothers, Lords Shoning and Jiang Chang, who smiled and greeted Master Feng. Our hero, looking at them, thought that it was because of these two stinkers that he had to undergo impeachment. Feng Jifan smiled, waved his hand at them and sighed, saying his respects and greeting the men. The guy addressed them as uncles, and they smiled sarcastically right in the face of our hero. The guy said that it seems thanks to them that he was persecuted. The men's faces immediately changed. They were scared and surprised. One of the men did not understand how the guy was still intact, because if he was already in the know, then His Majesty should have tried to settle the matter. Our hero said that the gentleman was very merciful and fair, and therefore he did not judge him and sent him to study side by side with the crown prince. From this news, the brothers were even more shocked. They did not understand how this was possible, and thought that our hero was already dead. Listening to all this, the Empress understood that if the master appointed Ji by accepting her son as a training partner, her brother's accusations ultimately turned out to be groundless and malicious. The girl added that our hero must have done something incredible, since he managed to prove his loyalty and win the trust of His Majesty, and now he will become a support for the crown prince. She also added that Feng Jifan saved her daughter and will now support her second child, and a similar person. The Empress was angry that such a person was simply taken and removed because of two fools related to her. Our hero understood everything, and so he turned away and said that it was time for these two to get a strong slap in the face from their own sister. The guy walked up to a beautiful and expensive yellow curtain and then opened it slightly to look inside. Our hero walked inside and looked at everyone who was in this room. There was a young girl. The girl stood with her subject and addressed our hero as Master Fen. Our hero bowed to her and greeted the young girl, Her Highness the Princess. However, a moment later, after the greeting, our hero was very surprised. What happened? The princess turned to our Feng Zifanyu, asked him to please continue. The guy became embarrassed and thought about the fact that he had never really looked at the princess's face before. Thinking about some indecent things, the guy became embarrassed and smiling asked what they would name their future children. The princess was at a loss. The servant cleared her throat and asked the guy to finally begin the examination. Making a dissatisfied face, our hero groaned and said that this was a huge annoyance, and then tisked with displeasure. The guy approached the princess and asked her to give her hand, and the guy examined it. The girl was scared and afraid to give the guy her hand. Our hero smiled and asked if there was any other way to identify the princess's diagnosis. The frightened and trembling girl extended her hand to our hero and sighed heavily. It was hard for her. Feeling the princess's hand, our hero told her not to be afraid, because in the past he had already felt everything that was possible and impossible when she was dying. After such a statement, the girl was subjected to even greater shock. She did not understand what our hero was talking about and asked him again. The servant watched the two and did not understand anything. She just watched silently. The princess covered her mouth and said that there was no point in showing that something was wrong. Otherwise, our hero would again force her to drink that bitter medicine. Our hero, feeling the girl's hand, said that we just need to endure until the end. Feng Jifan smiled and said that everything seemed to be fine, and he saw no signs of illness. The girl became embarrassed. Our hero knelt down, folded his hands, and said that he was glad to know of the princess's welfare. The girl was a little surprised. Our hero made a serious face, and then said goodbye to the princess and headed towards the exit. The princess did not understand the actions of our hero, and was surprised at almost every action he took. The princess thought that the guy would paw her, but our hero told her to throw such thoughts out of her head, because he is a romantic, not a libertine. 12th year of Hongreign Z, 1499 BC. The young man went with his friend to the capital in order to take part in the upcoming metropolitan exam. However, he was eventually sent to prison due to his involvement in a case of cheating by his own comrade. Tan Bohu, whose real name was Tang Im, was very talented, for which he was even awarded the title Jie Yuan in Yingtian province. There's simply no point in him cheating. But due to Shu's close connections, Jin and the host jury, Chengming Zhen, still got caught. In order to save his idol, Fang Jirano is now obliged to prevent such an outcome at all costs. Meanwhile, at the Blessing Hotel, our hero's subordinate said that the person he was looking for was in this hotel. Being confident, our hero said that they needed to hurry, and he proudly entered the hotel. His subordinate ran after him. Our hero walked so fast that he did not notice the person walking opposite him, and they hit their heads against each other. Our hero grabbed his nose and told the guy he bumped into to watch where he was going and that it hurt terribly. The young man silently grabbed his nose and held on, not answering the man who crashed into him. While our hero was holding his nose, the subordinate pointed to the young man they bumped into and said that this was the same person that Fang Jirano was looking for. As soon as our hero heard this, he looked at the guy he crashed into and was dumbfounded in surprise. He was an ordinary, unremarkable young man with stubble who looked his age. Our hero thought that the guy looked too old and completely different from how he imagined him, and then added that even the desire to save had disappeared. However, he quickly changed his mind and said that since this person was his idol, he would try and give his best. Our hero greeted the guy and addressed him as Jie Yuan Tan, and then asked if he had said his name correctly. The guy folded his hands and greeted the stranger, saying that he had pronounced his name correctly, and also asked the name of our hero. Our hero smiled and introduced himself to the young man as Feng Jipan. The young man thought that our hero was the same Beijing bandit who was quite terrible according to his rumors. The guy became wary and bowed to our hero, and also hooted and said that he was very glad to meet them. Our hero said that he had heard a lot about the high reputation of the young man, and asked if he would like to sit together somewhere and chat. Our hero would be glad to gain new knowledge. Gee, somewhere, Panya. Our hero was very surprised by this manner and considered it quite rude, and he was also in shock. Nevertheless, the young man stopped, bowed to our hero again, and said that unfortunately, he had already invited his friends to drink together. Our hero was upset. Our hero suggested that the guy would now head to Shujin and Representative Chengming Zhen. Usually, senior officials very often look for gifted people. After promotion, they can found an alliance, when other newcomers are just looking for reliable protection and support for themselves. And usually such visits are normal and beneficial for both sides. Our hero made a serious face and said that he understands everything. Understands that the guy wants to achieve career growth. Feng Jifan added that, however, this would lead to disastrous consequences for the young man. Our hero called out to Jie Yuan Tan and asked him to wait. The surprised guy turned around and stopped. Our hero made a scary and serious face like a killer's, and said in a rough voice that they weren't finished yet. The frightened young man covered his face with his hands and said that they could sit with the gentleman another time. Our hero pointed his finger at Jie Yuan Tan and said that this does not cancel the words spoken now. He told the guy to take the risk of challenging him and said that he shouldn't drag himself with broken legs to his friends. An enraged Jie Yuan Tan shouted that there was nothing wrong with this. If anyone insists on leaving, he added that the emperor rules here, and the laws are written for everyone. Our hero, without slowing down, having listened to the angry guy's speech, punched him in the cheek as hard as he could. Our hero made a scary face and asked, "That's how it is." And then he added that he is the law. Our hero apologized to the young man and said that he would have to help him out even if he refused. Screams began to be heard from the hall. Everyone who was inside watched this spectacle and twisted their faces. The sight was not the most pleasant, and therefore some people even covered their faces so as not to see this horror. Our hero, together with his subordinate, beat Jie Yuan Tan, and he screamed in pain and said that they had never had any disagreements before. Then why were they beating him? Our hero smiled and said that they would see how the young man went to the meeting with a broken face. Jie Yuan Tan sat on the floor with his teeth knocked out and his face stuffed. He was completely beaten and did not understand why he was beaten. The guy with the knocked out teeth mumbled that this was simply outrageous, and it was wrong to do this. The young man began to shout that now everything was clear, because our hero's trio were also candidates for the upcoming exams. Perhaps our hero was afraid that he would surpass them. The young man continued to scream throughout the living room about how vile and despicable our hero is. Feng Jifan just looked at him and smiled. Everyone fell silent. Our hero began to laugh throughout the entire establishment. For him, the young man's words were very funny. Our hero stood in front of the beaten Jie Yuan Tan and asked if he dared to compare our hero's students with him. The young man with knocked-out teeth mumbled that in any case, our hero would not get off easy after this, because he had committed a serious crime. Our hero said that this was fair and invited Jie Yuan Tan to make a bet. The guy was silent. Our hero continued, saying that if his followers showed the best results, then he would recognize him as the greatest mentor. The beaten Jie Yuan Tan could barely get up and asked what would happen if our hero still lost the bet. Our hero made a terrifying face and said that then they would turn off the heads of every apprentice. Everyone who was inside noticed that a chill suddenly ran through their bodies after Feng's words, Zifanya. The subject said that these were just flowers. Offended and angry, Jie Yuan Tan said that they would look at it and told our hero, "Just wait." Our hero smiled and thought that the young man would recover for a month or two and would not be able to go on a visit in such a terrible state, and added that it was very cool to help people. A man ran into the hotel and started shouting at the entire hotel and asking who dares to disturb the peace of the capital and sow discord. Our hero, together with his subject, looked at the man in surprise, and the man continued to shout, telling the bandit to come out immediately and asking not to let him escape. At the entrance stood 3 men in blue clothes, each holding a stick. The one who shouted asked again whether the bandit really dared to beat the scientist and completely lost his shame. Suddenly, the man suddenly falls silent. He noticed something very frightening or surprising. He drew attention to our hero, namely to the shiny sword that he had in a sheath on his belt. The man got scared and cold sweat started running down his face. After such statements, he didn't know what to do. Our hero introduced himself as Feng Jipan. He said that he was the son of Feng Jinglong and smiled. The guy came closer to the man who was shouting loudly and asked what his name was. The scared man stuttered and said his name was Zhang Tsun. Our hero made a scary face and asked if the man could tell him how many people there were in his family. The man was even more frightened. The man bowed down and, being very frightened, said that there was only the eldest and the youngest. Our hero, pointing his finger back, asked the man if he had seen what had recently happened. Feng Jinfan continued, saying that the literate Tang Ying opened his hands towards the important gentleman and pointed his finger at the surprised and beaten young man. The frightened man, barely moving, said that he would now detain the young man because his behavior was not worthy of forgiveness. Our hero smiled and said that everything was fine. He also added that you shouldn't do this. The man was delighted and beamed with happiness. He said that the guy was a kind and merciful master, and also showed him his deepest respect and respect. The beaten Feng Jie Yuan Tang was beside himself with rage. He did not understand why they believed his offender. Meanwhile, in the same tavern Grace, some screams did not stop coming out of it. Our hero said that from this day on he will protect this place, and then pointed his finger at Jie Yuan Tan and said that whoever handles Tang Inem. The guy continued that those who befriend Tang Inem disrespect Feng Ji Panyu. The men who came to sort it out folded their hands and bowed to our hero, and also said afterward that they understood everything. The beaten Jie Yuan Tang asked to call a doctor and said that he would have to pay for everything. They told him that they would call him now. Civil strife led to infighting. Everyone's attention was focused on Feng's bet, Japana, that it will be won by Jie Yuan Tang and not Feng Ji's disciples Panya. It was a very intriguing battle. Meanwhile, some huge estate. There is bad weather outside, a snowstorm. Tons of snow fall to the ground. Our hero sat opposite his students and assumed that they were already aware of the latest news. Our hero's frightened and unsure students said that they knew everything. Our hero said it's time to teach his students, because this time they're going to kick Tang's ass Inu. The surprised students asked what the master would teach them this time. They were confused and joyful. Our hero took a huge stack of books and said that this is a kiloton of preparation material for exams and told the students to enlighten themselves. The happy smile suddenly changed into some kind of confusion. The students were upset that they had to cram mountains of material again. Our hero poked his finger in the forehead of one student and said that with their meager minds, passing the imperial exam was still a test, and therefore he ordered them to gnaw on the granite of science. Our hero, showing 2 fingers, said that every day, students will write 2 essays on topics chosen by him and plus answer questions. The guy said that among this pile of papers there are questions for this year's spring exam. Although they have already written a dozen papers, it's still not enough. To pass with excellent marks, you need to be able to write essays well. The examiner this time will be Lee Dong-yang. Fortunately, our hero has read his works, and for the most part, he remembers all the key points. Our hero said that he has a general idea, and this is very good, because it will be easier to teach students. Also, in addition to this, it is necessary to avoid the fiasco of swindlers. By today's standards, this is luck. But during the time of the imperial court, there was a persecution of candidates, Xu Jinya and Tang Ina. Suspects, the metropolitan exam is different from the provincial one. The latter is just flowers. This is roughly what a provincial exam looks like, where everything is quite strict. Everything takes place under the careful supervision of an examiner who has the full confidence of the imperial court. His verdicts are not discussed. And the metropolitan exam is for everyone. In addition to the examiner, representatives of the Ministry of Rights, the prosecutor's office, and the Imperial Academy are involved. It is precisely because people are so involved that deception is possible, which is why they are trying to take advantage of it. The chief examiner, Lee Dong-yang, was a respected man. There should have been no problems with him. And, according to historical references, with his assistant, Chungmun Jenem, also in complete order. The dog turned out to be close to the mundane. They simply became friends and began to communicate often. 2 talented scholars, who often came to stay with the assistant examiner, were accused of cheating because they passed the exam flawlessly. Our hero continued, saying that to avoid this, he built a wall between them and fenced off relations with outsiders. Our hero approached his students and asked what they were doing. The students said they were making friends. Enraged, Feng Jinfan shouted at his students and said that now they would make friends with his boot. The students ran away from our hero in fear. A servant approached the lying young man and said that the guy had guests. The beaten Jie Yuantang asked if his subjects really thought that he was able to receive someone. The subject was ashamed. He was embarrassed and said that the master was completely right. Our hero said that the beatings of Tang Ina were for his own good, and the guy himself lay in bed and did not understand why his whole body ached. Our hero was happy and said that he was a great fellow. He patted himself on the cheeks and could not be happier with himself. The guy, who was serious, made a rude tone and said that in short, he would make Tang killers out of the students Ina. The beaten Jie Yuantang was not going to give up. He believed that it was better to die than to give the victory to Ji Panyu. Each of the guys wanted to win. Their looks were filled with determination. They said that they would definitely win. New Year is very close, and many bureaucrats from John Shu's house are taking a vacation while everything is quiet. Our hero, entering the house, said that the guards were not asleep, and he, Fang Ji, was with them Pan. At any time of the year, and especially on holidays, it is his sacred duty to protect John Shu's house. Entering the room, our hero was in complete shock. He saw the young prince sitting by the books. Surprised, Feng Jinfan asked the prince what happened to him and why he was sitting by the books. The beaten prince turned to our hero. He had a black eye and a broken nose. He told Feng Jinfan himself guessed right 3 times. Our hero, making a surprised expression on his face, asked the prince if he had really been beaten again. The prince said that at the end of the year, the Ministry of Finance was conducting an audit of the books of grain and income. He heard his father talking about this, so he decided to help. But his father pecked him for his inactivity. Making a scared and sad face, the guy said that in the end he decided to prepare. Our hero thought that exactly. These are the foundations of the time. If a ruler does not study according to the 4 classics or the doctrines of the saints, preferring mathematics or military affairs, then he is considered lazy. The young prince said that it didn't matter how many times he was beaten. He would still finish the calculation. Our hero turned to the young prince and said that everything was fine and, taking the notebook from him, asked to take a look. Our hero read the notes, May 11th year, Hongzi, in the warehouse. There are 110,000 kilograms of silk, 330,000 bolts of fabric, and 93,423,000,000 grains. While reading the problem, our hero's head became swollen. He got distracted for a minute and said that he had a headache. Our hero said that the accounting of this time was so primitive, the bureaucrats from the ministry simply made a ton of additions and subtractions in a bunch of columns. And this is just the tables of the Jiangsu region. And what is in the larger ones, or God forbid the capital, is generally scary to imagine. The man counted and could not remember what the number was. All the horror in the calculations came from the fact that unforeseen expenses inevitably occurred during deliveries. This entailed a whole series of additional entries. By the end of the year, This invariably resulted in accounting hell. All accounting books are regularly checked by the relevant inspectors, and then compiled into a single state book. Our hero looked at the prince who was solving the problem and wondered if he could handle it. Feng Jifan turned to the young prince, who was struggling to make the correct calculations and solve the problem. The prince shouted at our hero and asked what he wanted, because of him he was confused, and asked our hero not to distract him. Our hero sighed heavily, said, "Okay," and asked to give him a notebook. He said that he would help the prince. The young prince was completely shocked that our Feng Jifan also knew mathematics. Our hero smiled sarcastically and said that the prince couldn't even imagine Feng's genius Zifanya. The young man thought about the fact that even though he is a humanitarian in life, but over the people of this era, he has an undeniable advantage in mathematics. All he needs to do is throw in at least the Pythagorean theorem, and China will move forward a couple of centuries. However, our hero said that he would not stupidly count their income. He said that he had the entire annual budget imprinted in his memory. After all, being an expert on the Ming dynasty, our hero was obliged to know the country's economic indicators by heart and remember everything to the last comma. The guy smiled and said that you couldn't write in the correct answers right away and he would put on a whole show. Our hero stood with his eyes closed and showed something on his fingers. He said, 1, 1, twice 2, 4, 3 times 3, 9, 4 times 4, and then some kind of nonsense began. The young prince looked at our hero with delight. He said that Jipan knows math, and because of this he is very cool. 2 days later, a snowstorm continued to rage outside. Snow covered the entire area and formed new snowdrifts. Our hero shouted that the job was done and began to laugh and laugh heartily. The young prince was shocked that Feng Jifan completed the task so quickly. He really knows math. Our hero smiled and said that he had already said that he was not a fool. He was proud of himself. This is a matter of paramount importance. The well-being of the people depends on him. Errors are unacceptable. This work takes the best minds 10, 15 days, but our hero did it in 2. The young prince smiled, took a notebook and a brush, and then told our hero to dictate everything to him. Feng Jifan smiled and laughed. He said that he knows the indicators not only for the current year, but for the 13th and 15th years, Hongzi. He also added that he generally knows all the years from Jiajing to Cunzhen, can even now tell about anyone from memory. Our hero said that they would start from the beginning of the year to the 7th day of the last month of the 11th year of Hunzi from the capital and other provinces. The imperial court received a profit of, in the amount of 2,754,622 silver bars, as well as 700,000 fabrics, 200,000 kilograms of tea, plus 700,000 grain seeds. The prince could not even verify the information, but decided to trust Jipanya and prove to his father that you don't need to be a genius to add up numbers, and let the paper scribblers languish over their books. The last days before the new year, the Ministry of Finance Li Dongyang is counting the expenses of the imperial treasury. All the officials continued to work hard and painstakingly without rest. They were very tired. The officials talked about how good it would be that Master Li would double-check the calculations. The emperor sat with his subordinates and smiled. He said that it seemed like nothing like that had happened and that they could celebrate. One of the officials turned to His Highness and said that with Fang Jipanem is in trouble. The man said that Fang Jipanya beat Yingtian's Tong Ying and smiled. The emperor got angry and said that this young man had no gift of character, but he was smart, and also asked who dared to beat him in broad daylight. The official said that the most surprising thing is that it was Tang Ying who started the fight, but there is no living space on him and he cannot get out of bed, and Fang Jipan doesn't even need henna. The emperor was a little confused, because he was told that something bad happened to our hero, but in the end, everything was fine. Official Zhu was also startled. He extended his fist to his mouth and coughed into it without saying a word. The second official continued the story, and said that the guys had made a bet on who would do better in the upcoming exam. According to past results, the best in Yingtian province is Tang Ying, and Ji's disciples Panya, the best in Shuntian, and it seems as if they are on the same level, but Fang Ji's students, the ladies, will probably lose. Students from the south have been showing the best results in the Battle of Wits for several years now. Looking at the same ministry heads, Li Dongyang and Shishan are the best of the best, and they are southerners. Liu Jian, which is from the northern part of the country, does not come close to them, although it is considered one of the best. The man said that in other words, Tang Ying should break the entire trio of Fang Jipanya with one left hand. The emperor grabbed his head. Even he thought that Fang Jipan had bitten off more than he could chew, but was curiously awaiting the resolution of this conflict. The prince ran into the emperor's room, who began to call his father and run to him as soon as possible. The emperor was surprised that his son came running to him, and looked at him with a questioning expression. The joyful young prince ran as fast as he could into the hall to his father, and shouted that the counting of the treasury was almost finished. The man immediately got angry and shouted at his son. He said that his son was talking nonsense, and even the ministry had not yet finished. The proud prince stood before the emperor and said that Fang Jipan has already done everything. The guy said that of course all this was done not without his help, but in the end they calculated everything. To improve the efficiency of annual calculations, Jipan also sent his essay to the ministry, in which he outlined all the best practices for managing funds. The essay was called Method of Credit Financing. It's a pity, but the ministers immediately tore it up. The emperor said that they did everything right. It would be better if the best minds of the country filled their heads with the nonsense of some youth, because the matter was serious, and Fang Ji, the lady, is childish, and he goes there too. The prince shouted that Fang Jipan sat all night working on the bill and he saw everything with his own eyes. The guy asked to let him read it. The guy started reading the calculations. The three main officials called it nonsense and said that it was bad future for their country. The guy continued and said that he doesn't trust anyone except Fang Jipanya. The guy said that our hero is his brother and would never lie to him. Emperor Hongzhi was surprised at his son's naive faith, but understood that the reason for this was the child's lonely childhood without friends. The emperor said that so be it. He would forgive his son this time, but asked him to stop acting like a fool. Angry, the young prince said that only one person was acting stupidly here, and that was his father. The emperor was furious at such an outburst from the son. He looked as if he was ready to kill someone. He rushed at his son with his fists and shouted that he was apparently tired of living, and his subjects held the man, asking him to calm down. The guy again shouted at his father and said that he could not hear him and again repeated that the emperor was stupid. The angry emperor asked the young prince what he said and asked him to stop making a joke. The emperor said that Fang Ji, the lady, is simply sucking up to the young prince and asked if this is not clear. The upset prince said that Fang Jipan would never lie to him and would make him sad. The father continued to shout and said that the guy had completed all the calculations for the day and also asked if the guy was really a god or a wizard. Sometime later, the Ministry of Revenue completed its count and provided a report. There were two books on the table, blue and green. The green one said it was the Ministry of Finance, and the blue one said it was Fang Ji Pan. The emperor began to compare these two reports and was shocked. The difference in the calculations was minimal. The error was not even in tens, but in units. The emperor thought for a moment and said, "Don't say that, Fang Jipan, this is a reborn academician." The joyful prince ran up to his father and asked if Fang Jipan was right after all. The young prince began to laugh at the emperor and say that he said that he was right, and added that his father was getting old and blind to the truth. Understandably, the man was unpleasant to listen to this. He looked at the young prince with a menacing gaze and asked his son how long he had been spanked. The guy folded his hands, bowed to his father, and apologized. He said that he was driven by a demon and the emperor, the most just and wise ruler. The man thought for a moment and said that the fact remains a fact. Fang Jipan is damn smart. The emperor already considered our hero very smart and began to be afraid that he could become a threat to them. Heavy thoughts settled in the emperor's mind. Therefore, he summoned Minister Li Dongyang for a conversation. The minister, as soon as he could, came to the emperor and they began a dialogue on a very important topic. The emperor asked if Master Li was thinking about our Fang Jipan. The man did not answer. Minister Li Dongyang hummed thoughtfully. He was in deep thought about the emperor's question. Minister Li Dongyang thought some more and said that Fang Jipan is a worthy sword in the hands of the crown. The emperor thought about the words of Minister Li Dongyang, and some interesting idea came to his mind. The minister said that His Royal Majesty was still young and naive. When the throne rightfully passed to him, the need for such a sword would be undeniable. He also added that our hero is a rogue, but with a sharp mind. The minister bowed down and said that the emperor could be calm about the future of the empire if the prince had such an advisor. The emperor said that he did not expect Minister Li Dongyang to hear such praise and smiled. But Master Li also added that the sword, like any weapon, is capable of striking its owner. Many great rulers fell victim to a stab in the back by their dearest blades. However, the man also added that in the case of our Fang Jipanem, this won't happen. The emperor pulled a menacing face and asked why Minister Li Dongyang thought so. Master Li said that people like Wen are dangerous swordsmen, possessing both intelligence and power. Rulers need gifted and capable people to whom they can delegate power, but over time the gifted can gain more power than the ruler himself. That's what happened to Wen Menem, who was an advisor to the emperor, was very beloved among the people, until one day he usurped the throne of the Han dynasty and began to rule there himself. But on the other hand, the emperor added that the guy's head was not all right. He had a bad reputation and a nasty character from the words of those around him. Even if he rebelled, who would want to mess with him? It was winter outside, a blizzard and a lot of snow. The snow remained on the roofs of the houses, and all the streets were decorated with lanterns. Some shouts could be heard from the tavern, and someone inside asked in what sense everything was sold out. The man in the tavern said that the Fang family bought all the food. They probably bought it for the miners in Shishan, and said that the man opposite would have to find another place for dinner. The men in the mine ate the food that was served to them. They said the food was very tasty. The men cried with happiness and said that Master Fan was a very wonderful person. A short and mustachioed man shouted, raising his hand up and drawing the workers' attention to himself. He said that they should come to him for his salary. The man poured a handful of gold coins into the hands of the worker and said that this was their salary. The mine workers cried with happiness. They were treated very well, and they thanked Mr. Fan. High city officials spit at the mention of Fangjipanya, but here, in the mines, the workers almost idolize his name, because without his intervention, they would have long ago died of cold and hunger. With your kindness on New Year's Eve, Jipan brought smiles back to their faces, and he placed real happiness in their hearts. Some fireworks began to be launched into the sky, a green trail, and the top was all bright and orange. Fireworks exploded in the sky, and bright orange and yellow sparks appeared in the sky. 2 men watched all this. The guy pointed his finger at the sky and shouted for people to look at the fireworks that were in the capital. Another guy watched all this. There was great surprise in his eyes. He said that the fireworks were very big, and they were bigger than last year. Meanwhile, from the house of our hero Fang Ji, I could hear Panya laughing and shouting something. The guy shouted that it was all him, Fang Jipan. He shouted for people to see his supernova fireworks. Our hero's servant looked at the sky, then closed his eyes, folded his hands, and wanted to say something. Our hero looked and didn't really understand. The servant asked to bless him with a beautiful wife and 2 strong sons. Our hero watched his servant and sighed lightly and said that these were just commoners. The guy smiled. Our hero closed his eyes, folded his hands, and said that he, perhaps, would also make some kind of wish. The guy also thought that he really wanted a beautiful wife, and quickly, and also prayed if he could marry princesses. Meanwhile, the princess our hero was thinking about sneezed and thought about a wish. The girl made a wish and hoped that all illnesses would bypass her and Fang Jipan is with them. The young prince wished that he would receive Fang Ji's intelligence Panya. Let's make him a little stupider. The guy did it with a malicious smile. The princess thought it was ugly. From the fact that 2 people simultaneously remembered our hero, Fang Jipan sneezed twice. Our hero's subject asked if his master was healthy, and if everything was fine with him. He said that he had caught a cold, but everything was fine. 2 offended brothers prayed that our hero Fang Jipanya developed hemorrhoids. From this, our hero sneezed even more. Snot poured out of his nose like a river, and from the outside it seemed as if he was very sick. Ji Yuantang prayed that he would one day be able to punch Fang Jipanya on the first day. Our hero was very torn from endless sneezing. Everyone wished him something bad. The servant thought about what they say, that when you sneeze once, it means someone misses you. Twice, it means they are calling you names, and 3 times, it means they wish you ill. The surprised servant asked who could wish something bad for the young master. Our hero, aggressively covering his nose, told him to leave and not touch him. Our hero quietly mumbled that the whole half of the entire kingdom hates him, so this is not surprising. Looking at his father, our hero was surprised that his father was also making a wish on this beautiful night. Fang Jipan flew up to his father and asked what he was wishing for, and also tried to guess that it was a lot of wealth. The man was very scared. Ji's father, Panya, began to wave his hands and say that he had not wished for this at all, but something else. The guy looked at his father incredulously. Then our hero made a malicious smile and teased his father, saying that he apparently became lonely and wished for Mademoiselle. The father became very embarrassed and asked what his son was talking about. The guy held his head and couldn't guess what his father could have wished for. He said that he needed to think a little about this mysterious question in order to guess accurately. The father laughed and looked at his son. He asked Fang Ji. The gentleman stopped talking nonsense and listened to him. The man said that his most important and cherished desire is... After a short pause of 30 seconds, the man said that his main and cherished desire is the well-being of his beloved son, Fang Jipanya. Our hero was very surprised. Looking at the fireworks, our hero's father said that as long as his son was alive and well, he would be the happiest father in the world. This touched our Fang Jipanya. The young man, out of excitement, could not properly release the air from his lungs and tried to catch his breath. This really touched him very much. Our hero cried, and while watching the fireworks, he told his father not to worry, and they would definitely live a long, wonderful, and happy life together. Liu Jin, a pardoned criminal who became a eunuch servant in the imperial chambers, lives happily ever after thanks to his closeness with the crown prince. Although he occupies a low position, this person will soon become even more of a bastard. Having gained the trust of the emperor, he will slowly but surely destroy all rivals at court, and he usurps power, filling the emperor's ears with sweet speeches. The man smiled sarcastically. This man was a real villain who wreaked havoc wherever he could reach. Interesting shot, isn't it? Only with the advent of Jipanya, everything has gone wrong. One day on an ordinary winter day, an explosion occurred in one of the huge buildings. Everyone around was screaming and a huge cloud of smoke rose into the sky. One of the men shouted, "No, he said that this cannot be and should not be like this." Subjects carried a very badly wounded man out of the building in their arms. The servants shouted that they needed to call a doctor. Liu Jin, who had his teeth knocked out and was all battered after the explosion, asked why all this was happening to him and cried. The young prince watched as many servants hovered around Liu Jin and tried to help him. The young prince watched the whole spectacle and said that this man was badly beaten and called him a poor fellow. Our hero sat next to the prince and thought perhaps there was too much gunpowder and said that he needed to change the proportions. The merry prince turned to Fangji Panya said that next time he should ask someone else to light the fuse. Our hero silently stirred something in the mortar. Our hero looked at the prince, laughed and said that he and Liu Jin were enough. The young prince got to the bottom of our hero and asked whether it was sane to condemn only one person to this. Our hero said that Liu Jin is already experienced and if he asks a beginner he may get burned or worse injured. The prince looked at our hero, smiled sarcastically and said that he understood everything. Some time passed. Our hero and the prince went their separate ways. There was still a snowstorm outside. The prince approached the man who exploded and put his hand on his head and then asked how he was. Looking at the exploded Liu Jin, the prince said that he was very worried, but the man did not understand anything. The prince made a sweet face and asked if Liu Jin was in much pain. He paused for a moment. The man told His Highness not to worry about him and added that he was in perfect health and also thanked him for his concern. The prince continued to look at Liu Jin with his innocent, sweet face and said that in that case, let the man continue. The man's face became stony. He turned pale and then sighed heavily and was about to leave. There was another huge explosion. A huge cloud of smoke rose in the sky, and screams were heard again. Liu Jin, battered from the explosion, lay on the ground and exhaled smoke from his mouth. He clearly did not feel very well. Our hero looked at the picture of what was happening, and wondered what was not working again. The prince said that it looked like several more tests would be needed. Poor Liu Jin lay on the ground and a young prince came up to him and stood over his head. The young prince leaned over and looked at Liu Jin with his cute face. He asked how the man was feeling. The man could no longer speak. He began to cry and try to utter simple words. Another series of explosions occurred. Explosion after explosion. And poor Liu Jin flew in different directions and received a lot of pain. The enraged Liu Jin shouted that he could no longer do it and asked His Highness to take pity on him, because there was no longer any living space left on him. Our hero laughed and said that this was a complete surprise, and then added that undermining assholes is very pleasant and fun. The young prince pulled Liu Jin by the legs and said that he could still crawl, but they didn't need anything more, and also asked him to do them a favor once again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe.